This video is designed to help you relax or fall asleep. Before we begin, if you think you might fall asleep, please introduce yourself in the comments. Please also like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. As always, I'd love to know where you're watching from. So let us know in the comments and share what time it is where you are. Thank you once more for joining me. Get comfortable, grab a glass of water, make sure you've locked your door, and turn off the lights. Don't forget to say hello in the comments. It's time to close your eyes. This encounter happened when I was about 10 years old. My sister and I were home alone since it was during the summer, but our mom and grandmother were busy so they couldn't stay home with us. We were used to being home alone during the summer, so it wasn't a big deal. The only thing we could not do was go outside or open the door if someone knocked. During this day, I had gotten up and started to play The Sims 2 in our kitchen. My sister was watching TV. A few hours into gaming, I thought I heard the doorbell ring. At first, I thought it was my game, but I had turned off the sound. So, I asked my sister if she heard the doorbell. She replied that she hadn't. She said it was probably just the show she was watching. I brushed it off and went back to playing my game. About 10 minutes later, I saw a reflection on my computer of a man in a suit, his hands cupped around his eyes, looking through the glass doors behind me. I turned around to be face to face with this strange man I'd never seen before. I had no idea how long he had been watching me. He waved at me like he knew me from somewhere. I called my sister's name, who had not noticed the man yet. She quickly grabbed the house phone, calling our grandmother. We had seen salespeople before, but none of them looked like this guy. He was wearing a full-on black suit that did not fit him. If not strange enough that this guy was wearing a suit in 99 degrees, he was also carrying a briefcase. All the salespeople I'd seen only ever had a clipboard or maybe a couple of flyers, but this man had a briefcase. The next flag came when this guy walked around our house to come to the back door, which during his little trip he would have seen there wasn't a car in the driveway, indicating no one was home. As I was getting up to hide, the man reached down and grabbed the doorknob, starting to jiggle it forcefully. Thankfully, the door was locked. He looks at me, smiling, and gestured at me to come and unlock the door for him. All the noise he'd been making had now set off our 75-pound lab mix, making her go berserk. No way she was going to let this guy get to us if he did get in. My sister tells me our grandmother is on the way, and she wanted us to hide in the back of the house in her room until she could get home. My sister hands me the phone, then runs into the kitchen to grab the biggest knife we have. I can hear her yelling at the guy that we called the cops. She comes back into the room with me, and we shut the door. She tells me after she lied to the guy about calling the cops, she said that he started laughing like she just told the funniest joke he ever heard. A little while later, we heard the door open and my grandmother calling us. We come out to meet her. She tells us she did not see a man anywhere in sight. She'd walked around the whole house before unlocking the door. She also thought it was weird if he was a salesperson, he would have left a note saying, "Sorry, we missed you." She ended up taking the rest of the day off to stay with us, also so she could watch to see if the man would come back around. It's been 11 years since this encounter, and I still don't want to know what was in his briefcase. This incident occurred almost 5 years ago, shortly after I moved into my current home with my husband. It was our first week at the new house. I had just graduated from grad school and was in the process of job hunting. Our house is modest but had 2 stories, with both bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. It's a back house facing an alley, and our landlord and his wife live in the front house. One morning, as my husband was leaving for work, he abruptly came back inside. "Did you try to remove a screen from a window downstairs?" he asked. I was puzzled and told him I hadn't. He urged me to come outside, so I quickly got dressed and followed him. To our alarm, the screen covering a large window downstairs was bent at a sharp angle, as if someone had attempted to push it up from the bottom. The most unsettling part was the clear prominent handprint on the glass, suggesting that the would-be intruder had tried to push up and open the window. Fortunately, all our downstairs windows are secured with wooden rods wedged in the top half, effectively preventing them from being opened too much. Our analog security measures had unexpectedly saved us. Additionally, we noticed another window screen slightly cut open at the corner. We immediately called the police, who came and dusted for fingerprints on the handprint, but unfortunately, it didn't lead to any developments. At the time, break-ins during the middle of the workday were not uncommon in our neighborhood, as most people would be away from their homes. However, what truly unnerved me was the realization that our would-be intruder had chosen to attempt a break-in in the middle of the night while we were both home and asleep. My car was parked right by the tampered window, clearly indicating that someone was home. It was a bold and foolish move on the intruder's part, especially since they left behind an almost perfect handprint on the window. Although it might not seem like it, this incident happened quite a while back, probably over 10 years ago. I was in my later years of high school and was home alone. My parents were at a wedding that required them to stay at a hotel, and my brother worked the night shift at that time. My family lived in a very well-known East Coast city in a blue-collar neighborhood that was starting to take a nosedive. As a teenager, I was a bit of a loner. I wasn't a nerd or anything. I was a big guy who had friends and went on dates, but I'm a natural introvert, so I cherished the rare alone time that I got. This weekend, I was looking forward to engaging in my normal empty house routine, playing PlayStation on the big screen TV, then ordering a late takeout dinner, pizza or Chinese, and pigging out while watching some Dragon Ball Z. Then, around 2 a.m., I would fall asleep on the couch with my old dog, Cecil. Cecil was a beagle who was as old as the hills and had been in our family for about 8 years. He was quiet and peaceful, spending his time begging for food and sleeping. Unlike most beagles, Cecil never howled or barked. He was more than content to rest his head on your lap and spend the night there. Anyway, back to the story. It's approximately 1 a.m. I had just finished the last slice of pizza and was dozing off on the couch when I heard a bang coming from the back alleyway. I didn't think much of it. Anyone who has lived in a city knows noises happen at all moments of the night. Cecil's head pops up off my lap, and the hair on his back stood up. He was always a bit skittish, so I calmed him down and started dozing off again. Not more than 2 minutes later, I heard another bang, and Cecil did something I'd never seen him do before. He leapt off the couch and ran like the wind towards the door leading to the basement, barking and growling like a dog twice his size. The look on his face reminded me of a German Shepherd from a K9 unit. I'd never seen him like that before, which got my adrenaline pumping. Through the dog's barking, I could now make out a persistent banging. There was a seldom used door in the basement that led out to our back alleyway. It was old and rusted and was hard to open even with a key, and it made a lot of noise. I suddenly realized that someone was trying to break into my house through my basement door. For a quick bit of context for anyone who hasn't lived in a bad neighborhood, if someone tries to get into your house and moves on after they realize the door is locked, they want your stuff. If someone is persistently trying to get into your house despite the door being locked, well, they want you. Knowing this, I rushed upstairs to grab the heavy wooden baseball bat that I kept under my bed for situations like this. Then I headed down to my basement. I probably should have run, but I was a macho teenager with a tough guy complex, and I also didn't have anywhere to go. While I was heading down the stairs to my basement, Cecil blew past me with the speed and aggression of a dog half his age. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice saying, "Oh," and the banging stopped. I didn't call the cops or anyone else, which was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I just sat up for the rest of the night with a bat in hand. My brother came home that morning, and I told him what had happened. We went to the basement door to take a look, and when we gave it a tug to open it, the whole door fell off. This psycho was one good shove away from getting into my house, but old Cecil scared him off. I'm pretty sure that fat, lazy old dog saved my life. When I tell people this story, they dismiss his actions as a dog doing what a dog does. But when I tell you that Cecil never barked or moved that fast in his life, you can take that to the bank. It was almost like he knew the urgency, like he knew that door was going to give. A few years back, we had to have him put down because he got too old and was in a lot of pain. Before the injection, I got a moment alone with him. I thanked him one last time for his friendship and for what he did that night. At this point, I was a grown man with a wife and kids. I'm convinced that none of that would have happened without old Cecil. Thanks, pal. I miss you. This happened back in the 80s, so it was before we had cell phones. I was in high school at the time. One night after dinner, my mom suggested we take a walk around the block. My brother and dad were watching TV and opted to stay home, so it was just us girls. We lived on the fringes of the suburbs in a subdivision that was semi-rural. By that, I mean there were houses but no street lights or sidewalks. Everyone had septic tanks as there was no sewer service, and that kind of thing. The houses were all set well back from the road, and the lots were wooded. Anyway, we were walking around the block, which is about 1.5 miles in total, and we were almost back home. It was pitch black that night, there was no moon, and we had a flashlight to use as needed. Without it, you couldn't see much past a foot around you. We mainly used it as a signal if a car went by, but there wasn't really anyone around, so we had it switched off and were just walking and chatting. Just as we turned the corner onto our street, we suddenly heard footsteps behind us. This was a bit weird as we had just come from that way and hadn't seen or heard anyone walking on that street or coming down the driveways we passed. But we just figured it was some neighbor also out for a walk, and we hadn't noticed them in the dark. So I turned around to look and switched the flashlight on to see who it was. They immediately switched a flashlight on too, so I could only see their light and not the people holding it. They said nothing. We kept walking, but the footsteps behind us sped up. Now they sounded heavy, so we thought it was a man. We sped up. He sped up. I turned the flashlight back on, and he turned his on again in silence. We were too scared to call out, and now we were approaching our driveway. As we got there, I pushed my mom in front and told her to get up the driveway, which was steep and long. Once she had a start, I sprinted up after her. As I did, the footsteps veered away to the other side of the road and kept going. Nothing was ever said by this person, and normally people here wave and speak while walking or even driving by. When we got up to the house, my dad said it was probably just a neighbor, so my brother and I got into my car and drove down the road to see who it was. No one was there. We went all around the roads, and no one was walking on them. There wasn't time for him to leave the area either. It turns out it was a nasty neighbor getting off on scaring us and then ducking into a house. He bragged about it to some other neighbors who happened to be friends with my dad. We got revenge on him, but I can't say what we did exactly. I'm a security guard for an alarm response company. We answer alarms for businesses and private residences. 99% of the time it's a motion detector set off by a cat, or a restaurant forgot to disarm their stuff before the stock truck arrived to unload. In this case, I was called out to a house where the back door alarm was set off. Like it thought someone opened it. The owner was out of town, but she was alerted by her app and her mother met me there. We checked the door, it's locked. We figured maybe someone tried the door but it didn't budge, setting off the alarm. But there's a light on inside. The mom mentions this to her daughter on the phone. The daughter says she isn't sure if she left the light on or not. It's a good idea to make people think someone's home, but she just isn't sure. That gave me a bad tingle. The mother wanted to go inside to check. However, she didn't have a spare key. The neighbor did, but they were asleep and the mom didn't want to wake them. So, I fill out my papers and go back to my normal patrol routes. An hour later, the same home sends an alert out. I'm the only one in my city zone, so I answer it again. When I pull up, police and CSI are there already and they're talking to the mother and the now awake neighbor. They are reviewing video footage sent to them by the daughter. I look at the footage. There were 4 men that were armed wearing masks and hoodies. They came out of the bathroom a minute after the mother and I left. They proceeded to rob the place. They had broken in and locked the door behind them for appearances. They're the ones who turned on the light. The mother told me 3 guys had robbed her daughter's home a month before. Somehow, they knew when this girl would be out of town. They appeared smart, desiring a quiet robbery without conflict. But they brought guns, so they were prepared to shoot their way out of trouble if they needed to. The mother had wanted to go in. If she'd had a key, or woken the neighbor for the spare, we would likely have been shot dead by these guys when we went inside. Work doesn't give me Kevlar vests or anything. If I ever get another house call and someone's in there, I am not going inside no matter what is asked of me. I count myself fortunate the way was blocked this time because I was prepared to foolishly go in and check if I could. The 1% of the calls where something is actually off, it has never been as bad as this one. This just happened last night. I live alone with 2 cats, like a typical Redditor. This incident might sound mundane, but it was genuinely creepy in real life. I don't scare easily, for what it's worth. Anyway, there's a cat door on the rear slider which faces the woods behind my condo. The cats get supervised outside time, and I use a little nanny cam to check that they're checking in regularly, among other things. I can watch it from my computer or phone while doing stuff. I also occasionally get neighbors' cats who come in for a bite to eat, My male cat loves it, my female cat hates it. Anyway, this one gray cat comes around every few days, comes in, has a snack, I scoot him out, and it's no big deal. Well, he'd been coming around really late at night and pawing at the locked cat door. It scared me at first because it was a terrifying sound to hear in the middle of the night. I was able to figure this one out pretty easily just by listening. My cats would run to the rear slider, my female cat would hiss, the male would meow, and then I would hear something scamper away. I told myself it was just the neighbor cat coming for a midnight visit and probably just couldn't get in. Anyway, my nanny cam has automatic night vision which turns on when it's too dark. But I had the cats inside with me last night, so the cat door was locked shut, the patio light outside of the slider was turned off, and I was getting into bed just as I got under the covers. I heard the scratching, rattling sound at the locked cat door. I opened the app and definitely did not see a cat. It didn't help that the night vision makes everything look super creepy, but regardless, I was freaked out. There was a scraggly looking person hunched over on my patio, playing with the locked cat door. My female cat hissed, and he got up and laughed. I guess it could have been a she. I never saw a face and I only caught a few frames while my blood ran cold. It looked like they were wearing a loose t-shirt. I called the cops, and they had a cruiser nearby. He did a drive-through and walked the area out back. It was late, so I didn't give a statement or even meet with the officer, but I did see his flashlight as he walked the train line. Thankfully, that was the end of it. Although my cats refused to use their door for a few weeks afterwards, as if they could smell the strange intruder. I'm a female, and this incident occurred in 2008 when I was 13 years old. I'm now 27. I remember it as if it were yesterday. I lived in Cincinnati at the time, and it was January. My middle school had been called off due to a snowstorm the night before, and I was home alone because my dad and stepmom had to go to work, which meant my little sister was at daycare and my older brother had a dentist appointment. My dad worked in lawn care and sometimes came home for lunch if he was in the area. So, when I was awoken by noises coming from the basement, I thought it was just him, home for lunch, going through things in the basement. I didn't think much of it. When I got out of bed, I could still hear what I thought was my dad in the basement. But as I approached the stairs, something felt extremely off. I don't know what caused me to do this, but instead of yelling, I whispered, "Dad, is that you?" He didn't respond, so I quietly went to the front door, looked out through the tiny square window, and saw two men walking up the snow-covered hill to my backyard. I later found out that there was a third man, and he was the one who broke the basement window. I quickly realized that the noises I heard were actually from the basement window, directly under my bed, being broken. I ran to my bedroom, immediately hopped into my closet, and called my mom. When she answered, and I told her what was happening, she called my brother to see if he would come home because I had a history of being scared to be home alone. Neither of them actually believed that there were people in the house. Before my brother got there, and right after I got off the phone with my mom, I called the cops. I don't think the dispatcher believed me at first because she asked me several times if I was sure there were people trying to enter my house. Meanwhile, the three men had already entered the house and were running up the stairs from the basement. After I told her that, I immediately noticed a change in her voice, and she told me to stay calm and asked me if I was in a safe place. I told her I was in my bedroom closet, except the door wouldn't close all the way because my room was only clean because I threw a lot of it in my closet, so I had to hold my closet door shut. The dispatcher told me to let her know what I could hear, if anything. I told her that I heard them talking to each other in the living room, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. The next thing I knew, they were breaking down the door of my dad's bedroom, which was right next to my room. Not long after that, I saw through the crack of my closet door one of the men enter my room, and a few seconds later, he walked back out, obviously realizing it was a child's bedroom and that he wasn't going to find anything worthwhile in there. A few moments later, one of the men shouted, "He's home!" and they all started running away. A bit of backstory about the house: it was fairly old. So to open all of the windows, even the basement ones, you had to crack a lever to open or close them. Unlike the glass block windows that can't be broken or seen through. Not only that, but the front door didn't open because the house had settled too much and wouldn't unlock, so the couch was in front of it. Because the front door didn't work, we used the side door to get in and out. I'm not sure why, but the side door had to be unlocked with a key from the inside of the house to be able to leave. Everybody had a key besides my little sister. That being said, the men had to leave the way they entered, with everything they were trying to steal, which was through the basement window. After the dispatcher informed me that the police had my house surrounded and it was safe to come out, it took me quite a while to leave my closet because I didn't truly know if they were gone. When I finally got the courage to get out, I grabbed my key and darted to the side door to let the police inside. I didn't see my brother anywhere, so I didn't know if something had happened to him or if it was even him who came. Not long after I let the police inside, my brother came walking into the dining room. I jumped up so fast and gave him the biggest hug I'd ever given him. When the police asked us to tell them what happened, I heard my brother tell them that when he got to the house, he walked up to the side door as he normally would, and when he was about to unlock it, he was met by one of the men through the window. He said the man cocked his gun, put it up to the glass, and said, "Hey." After that, he said he froze up, and then when he could finally feel his legs again, he ran up the street and started knocking on doors. After about 3 houses, he knocked on the 4th, and a little girl answered. He asked her to go get her mom. He told her that there were men inside her house and his little sister was inside. She called the police, and my brother then called our grandparents to let them know that I was telling the truth. The township reached out to my dad and invited us to come to the town center about a week after the break-in. When we got there, I was surrounded by the officers who apprehended the men, and they awarded me with a certificate of bravery for staying calm and helping them catch the man, along with a little gift bag of girly items. About a month later, we had to go to the men's court date, where we met a woman and her son in the waiting area who had their house broken into a week before ours was broken into. It just so happened that they stole one of the guns she had. As it turned out, the 2 men had 3 guns, but only one of them was loaded. I was way too overwhelmed to be in the courtroom and had to see the man again, so the judge allowed us to stay in the waiting area until their hearing was over. 2 of the men ended up getting 7 years in prison, and the other got 12 years in prison because he pulled a gun on my brother. They're all out of prison now, and for a little while, I was scared that they would come back once they got out, because my dad still lives there, but nothing has happened since then. I've always heard stories about houses being broken into, but I never thought it would happen to me. I'm really glad that I was old enough to know what to do in that situation and that the man never knew I was in the house with them until they were in court, because who knows what they would have done if they knew. This story happened about 2 years ago when I was 19 and my foster sister was 16. It was the summer before I was going to college, and I mostly lived with my mom and my sister except for every other weekend when I'd stay with my dad. Summers where I live can get really hot and humid, so we had a habit of walking the dogs around 7 p.m. when it would be cooler but still light outside. On this particular evening, Mom wasn't going to be home until late. She often participated in choirs, Bible studies, youth group events, and more, so it wasn't uncommon for my sister and I to be left home alone until 8 or 9 p.m. Therefore, it was up to us to walk the dogs by ourselves. Even though we lived in the countryside, we decided to drive 20 minutes to a park for a change of scenery. Let me explain the layout of the park for clarity. The park isn't very big, but it's popular because of its mile-long looping road with attractions like playgrounds, ponds, and a small country hall spaced out on the inner side. The outer side features just grass and trees with one playground at its end. It's common to pass people walking the loop at least twice if you're walking in opposite directions, but not if you're walking the same way. Any cars on this road can only drive in one direction because it's a one-way road. Everything about the walk started normally. We parked the car, leashed our dogs, and began walking the loop. Occasionally, we'd stop so I could take pictures of our dogs and my sister wrangling our larger dog, who pulls like his life depends on it and wants to smell everything. During one of these stops, a man in his 40s passed us walking in the same direction. He smiled at my sister, told us we had cute dogs, and continued walking. We thought nothing of it. After all, it's common to exchange greetings in the park. However, this man passed us again only 10 minutes later. This time directly across from where we first seen him. He greeted us again with a smile and a hi. This time, we both looked at each other, acknowledging the strange guy. It seemed odd that he had managed to loop back to us so quickly and that he had cut in front of us so closely, merely touching my sister. Not even 5 minutes later, the same man passed us again, cutting even closer and greeting us once more. This was the moment I decided we needed to leave. It was abnormal to pass someone 3 times so quickly on this loop without them taking a shortcut or altering their path significantly. We hurried back to our car. As we neared it, we noticed a car creeping along behind us. We stopped to let it pass, but it also stopped. When another car approached, the first car sped away. We quickly packed the dogs into our car and drove home. Once home, we settled in for the evening. Around 9:30, while we were in the living room, we noticed the ceiling light up momentarily as if from car headlights, but we dismissed it, thinking Mom was coming home. A few minutes later, the motion sensor light on the porch turned on. Soon after, we heard the storm door open, but no one came in. Our dogs suddenly started barking aggressively, and the storm door slammed shut. My sister, brave as she is, went outside with a kitchen knife to investigate, but saw a man's outline by our old dog kennel. She quickly came back inside, and we locked the door. I called my mom, who advised us to ensure all doors were locked and the dogs were inside. When she arrived home and we explained what had happened, we called the non-emergency police number. The officers who came did not find anyone and seemed to think we were overreacting. To this day, we still believe someone with malicious intent was at our house, possibly the same man from the park. Whether or not this is true, the experience taught us to always trust our instincts. If you feel someone is paying too much attention to you, do not head straight home. Be aware of your surroundings and stay in public spaces if possible. You never know who might be watching. About 12 years ago, when I was 9 years old, I was home alone with my 12-year-old brother. We were supposed to go to my aunt's house to have lunch and wait for my mother there. We got up at 10:30 a.m., I took a shower, and then my brother took one after I was done. After that, we were both in the bathroom brushing our teeth and finishing up when we heard someone knock on our door. Since every time someone knocked at our door they turned out to be a salesman or a Jehovah's Witness, we kind of waited for them to go away. After a couple of minutes, I went to see if they were still outside through the window, and no one was there. What a relief. We continued getting ready when we saw a shadow pass by through the bathroom window, which was kind of like a small square of frosted glass. We waited and watched just in case it was a bird flying by, when suddenly a hand hit it. We got scared. We didn't know what to do. My brother had his cell phone, so we immediately called the police. While it was ringing, we heard a loud bang at the door. Someone was trying to break it down. I don't know if they were kicking or ramming it, but it was one of the most frightening things I've ever heard. My brother told me to lock the bathroom door, so I did. They took 5 bangs before the perpetrator finally bashed the door open. The police answered. I remember the exact thing my brother said. He was whispering, his voice barely audible. "Hello, there's someone in our house, and I think they're stealing. We're at 1249 Maple Street. I'm with my little brother locked in our bathroom. Please hurry." While all this was happening, I was sitting against the wall, hugging my knees. It was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences ever. I could hear the man going through all of our stuff, emptying drawers, going up and down the stairs, opening cabinets. He even broke a few cups and plates. Then I heard the sound my cell phone makes when it turns off, and I remembered leaving it on the kitchen table. I felt so stupid for leaving it there. Things continued for a couple of minutes when we heard him trying to open the door to the bathroom. My brother got a hold of a big metal rod we had lying around there. The man started kicking the door, shouting, "Who's there?" We said nothing. Another kick, then another. I felt I was about to have an anxiety attack. My chest started to ache, I had chills, and it was really hot. I tried to remain calm, but it was just too much. After that, he stopped. We heard the door opening and then silence. We waited for almost 10 minutes before going out of the bathroom. The living room was a total mess, lots of papers and books on the floor, cabinets open, cups and plates scattered on the floor. In our mother's bedroom, the nightstand and the closet were open, and everything inside them was all over the place. Upstairs in our room, it was the same thing. In about 5 minutes, the man had gone through everything we had and left a total mess. After that, my brother called my mom, and she ordered us to go to my aunt's house as soon as possible, so we did. When we got there, I was a little more relaxed. My aunt was waiting with us with ice cream, probably because my mom had told her everything, and she wanted to calm us down a bit. We got back home at about 5 o'clock. My mom told her boss she had a home emergency, so she left early. She tidied up the house, cleaned up, and left everything the way it was before so we could be relaxed. I really appreciate her effort and my aunt's attempt to calm us down and do everything so we didn't have to think about it. According to my mom, the police got to our house after she arrived, about 3 to 4 hours after the incident. She explained everything, but because of a lack of evidence, nothing could be done. The man was never caught, and honestly, I don't think they even tried to search for him. The next few days, my mom was home with us. Now I tell the story as a funny anecdote. Luckily, no one was hurt, and he only took useless stuff, but at the time, I was really scared. To a 9-year-old, an experience like that can have serious repercussions. I'm lucky it never came to that, and I got over it after a couple of weeks. I'm currently 29, I'm a woman, and this took place when I was 14. I had just started 8th grade. I grew up in Southeast Texas, and as many of y'all know, fall is still very much a part of hurricane season. It was a Friday night, and it was just me and my mom at home. My dad was out of town for work. I originally had plans to spend the night at a friend's house, but there was a tropical storm coming, and my mom decided last minute that she would rather have me at home that night. I was quite annoyed. Tropical storms weren't normally taken too seriously. I honestly felt like she was overreacting. Of course, this was my mentality of, I'm 14, and therefore so grown up. My mom did feel bad, so we rented a bunch of movies, ordered a pizza, and got a bunch of ice cream for a great night in. My parents' bedroom was on the opposite end of the house from mine. Okay, this is important for later. We lived in a split-level house. The house I grew up in was built in 1950 and was a postmodern style, think Frank Lloyd Wright. The entire back part of the house was all floor-to-ceiling windows, about 8 to 9 feet tall, think of just a huge wall of glass. The whole house was an open floor plan, so the kitchen was the first defined room with walls on the first floor, and my bedroom was directly off of the kitchen, while my parents' room was at the top of the stairs. I apologize if this is difficult to visualize. This was a modern-style house, and it's difficult to describe. She had gone to bed around 10 p.m., and I went to my room to watch 2 movies that I had rented just for myself. The storm was really starting to get rough, the wind was picking up, and it was raining sideways. I was in the middle of watching The New Guy, and I still remember looking at my clock and it said 12:53 a.m. I was getting tired and could feel my eyes getting heavy. With the weather so bad, I remember thinking that maybe it wasn't so bad I had to miss the sleepover. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is a huge crash. It was one of the big windows in either the dining room or living room. Our neighborhood was in a really wooded area, and I thought that a tree or branch had fallen in the storm and had broken the window. I left my room and went out through the kitchen. Right as I was approaching the doorway from the kitchen to the dining room, I could see my mom coming down the stairs. I saw a man standing in our dining room covered in blood. Due to where he was standing, I couldn't get to my mom. He was young, early 20s, and was soaking wet and didn't have any shoes. He had literally run through our window. He was bleeding all over, had glass sticking out of him, and was standing barefoot in a bunch of broken glass. It took him a second for him to register both me and my mom, but when he did, he immediately launched into an explanation of how he was being chased by someone who wanted to kill him and we needed to call the cops. My still fairly innocent 14-year-old brain didn't doubt this at all, but my mom was eyeing him suspiciously. We moved into the kitchen and my mom grabbed her purse and held my arm to keep me close. I had grabbed a kitchen towel to try and help his bleeding. My mom pulled out her cell phone and started calling our neighborhood patrol. I noticed this, and so I quietly went and called the cops on our landline. We both finished our calls, and now we were just waiting. The guy couldn't sit still and kept getting up and looking through our kitchen windows and pacing back and forth. He didn't seem to notice that he was all cut up and bleeding everywhere. He starts muttering under his breath. What happens next happens really fast and becomes blurry a bit. But the doorbell rings. It was our neighborhood patrol that my mom had called. The doorbell sent the guy into a panic. He jumps up and suddenly grabs a hold of me. He has me in a chokehold, and my mom is now screaming to please let me go. He starts looking around all frantic and is pulling me through the dining room and living room toward our stairs. At some point, the bell rings again. My mom is following, still begging to let me go. He has me at the stairs, and my mom has the choice now to go to the front door to open it or follow him up the stairs. She runs for the door just as he pulls me up the last of the stairs. I hear our alarm start blaring. Normally we arm it at night, so you would need to type in the code before opening a door. He pulls me into my parents' room, but as soon as we get into the room, he drops me and starts to freak out. It was apparently all the lights. He starts smashing lamps trying to get all the lights off, screaming that they were burning him. There's a small garden off my parents' bedroom, and they have garden lights they turn on at night. He takes a chair and throws it at the glass door, trying to smash it so he can get to those lights. At least that's what it looks like. I had crawled to a corner to get away from him at this point. When he completely turns away from me to grab another chair, I make my run for it. I run down the stairs. The cops had made it into the house at this point and were at the bottom of the stairs with their guns drawn. One of them grabs my arm and pulls me out of the way once I reach the bottom and takes me outside to an ambulance and my mom. The adrenaline is coming down and it hits me what's happened, and I start shaking and can suddenly feel pain around my throat from where he'd been holding me in a chokehold. There's a lot of yelling and screaming from inside, and then maybe 10 minutes later, the cops come out with the guy in handcuffs. He sees me and tries to lunge at me, which was terrifying. I had a bruised windpipe, but was otherwise okay. I learned later that the guy was 20 years old and a chemistry major at one of the universities in town. Together with some friends, also chem students, they had made their own PCP. He had never tried PCP before and had a bad reaction. They had been driving to get some food when he first started acting paranoid and upset, and then at the drive-thru insisted they let him out and took off. Thinking you're being chased is a common hallucination to have when you start having a bad trip. Light sensitivity is also a common side effect in general for being high. But he wasn't a bad kid. He'd never been in trouble before, was a good student, and pretty much the last person you'd think would do something like this. Our house was the only one on our street that wasn't completely fenced off, and that's how he was able to reach the back and those windows. When I got older, it really hit me just how easy it is to become that kid. I had friends who ended up being chemistry majors and also tried some of their own creations. Thankfully, the night didn't end up worse because it definitely could have gone in an entirely different direction. This happened a few weeks ago, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. My name's Kyle, and I have rented a remote cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. I was looking forward to some peace and quiet, but what I ended up experiencing was anything but relaxing. The cabin was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. I arrived on a Friday evening and spent the night settling in, enjoying the solitude. Everything seemed perfect until around midnight when I heard strange noises coming from outside. At first, I dismissed it as branches scraping against the walls or maybe some nocturnal animals. But when I heard a loud thud, I decided to investigate. I went outside with a flashlight and checked around the cabin. The night was eerily silent, with only the occasional rustle of leaves. I inspected the locks on the doors and windows, and everything seemed secure. I went back inside, feeling a bit uneasy but hoping it was just my imagination. The next day, I spent the afternoon hiking and enjoying the scenery. When I returned, I noticed that the lock on the back door looked tampered with. My heart sank. I was certain I'd locked it before heading out. I checked the cabin thoroughly but found nothing out of place. I tried to call the rental agency, but there was no cell service. I felt increasingly uneasy but decided to stay put and make the best of it. That night, I took extra precautions. I set up makeshift alarms with cans tied to strings around the cabin and checked the locks repeatedly. I went to bed, but sleep was elusive. Archer, my German shepherd, was unusually restless, pacing and growling intermittently. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed a large kitchen knife before heading into the living room. To my horror, the back door was wide open. Archer was barking furiously, and I could hear footsteps moving quickly outside. My heart was pounding as I stepped outside, clutching the knife. The forest was pitch dark, and I could barely see anything. I heard the footsteps getting louder and then saw a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. Before I could react, the figure lunged at me. He was a frail, disheveled man, his clothes tattered and his face twisted with desperation. I swung the knife instinctively. The man, clearly weak and unsteady, staggered back. He tried to grab me, but I managed to push him away. He let out a guttural cry and tried to scramble back into the forest, but he was slow and uncoordinated. I could see the fear in his eyes as he fled deeper into the woods. Shaking and adrenaline-fueled, I quickly secured the door and windows once more. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but the thought of navigating the dark, unfamiliar forest alone was daunting. I realized I had to get out and find help. I grabbed a flashlight, a few essentials, and Archer, and headed for the trail I had hiked earlier. The forest was terrifying at night, with every shadow and sound making me jump. Archer was on high alert, and I kept a tight grip on the flashlight, using it to illuminate the path as best as I could. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever. The trail was overgrown, and I had to push through thick underbrush. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf felt like an imminent threat. My anxiety mounted with each step, but I knew staying at the cabin was not an option. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small clearing and finally got a weak cell signal. I called the police and explained this situation as best as I could, though I was breathless and panicked. They assured me they'd send help and advised me to stay put until they arrived. I waited in the clearing, clutching Archer and trying to stay calm. It was nearly dawn when the police finally arrived. They took my statement and conducted a search of the area. They found evidence of the man's presence but couldn't locate him. They advised me to leave the area immediately and head to the nearest town. I was exhausted and shaken, but I followed their advice. The drive out of the woods felt surreal, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. When I finally reached the town and got to a safe place, I was relieved but still rattled by the night's events. I've since been in contact with the police, who are still investigating. The whole experience has left me on edge, and I'm wary of venturing into the woods alone. The sense of vulnerability and fear has stayed with me, and I'm trying to move past it. This happened just a few weeks ago, and it's left me feeling very paranoid. I live alone in a small apartment in New York City. My name's Lucas, and I'm used to the hustle and bustle of city life. I've always felt safe in my apartment, but that changed dramatically a few nights ago. I was alone at home for the weekend. My friends had all gone out of town, and my girlfriend was staying with her family for a few days. I spent Friday evening just relaxing, catching up on some TV shows, and ordering takeout. Everything seemed normal. By 11 p.m., I was ready for bed, so I locked the front door and double-checked the windows. I live on the 10th floor of a high-rise, and my apartment has a decent view of the city. The streets below are usually bustling, but at night, it's quieter. I turned off the lights and was in bed by midnight. I had just started drifting off when I heard a faint scratching noise. It was coming from the living room. At first, I thought it might be the sound of something from the building settling or maybe a stray cat on the windowsill. I decided to ignore it and tried to go back to sleep. But the scratching sound continued, and then I heard what sounded like a muffled thud. Now fully awake, I got up and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I tiptoed out of the bedroom and into the living room, scanning the room with the flashlight. The apartment was empty, and nothing seemed out of place. I checked the front door, which was still locked, and the windows, which were securely shut. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just the building's old pipes or some other city noise. Just as I was about to head back to bed, I heard the scratching noise again, this time coming from the kitchen. My heart started racing as I slowly approached the kitchen door. I took a deep breath, turned the handle, and flicked on the light. Nothing seemed out of place in the kitchen either. I decided to check the small utility closet, where I kept some cleaning supplies. As I opened the door, the scratching sound grew louder. The closet was empty except for a few mops and cleaning products. I turned around, feeling increasingly anxious, and noticed the back window was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it before bed. I immediately closed and locked the window, but my sense of unease only grew. I called the building's security to see if they could do a quick check of the hallways and exterior. They assured me they'd send someone up right away. While waiting for security, I decided to take a quick look around the apartment once more. That's when I noticed something chilling. The window to the fire escape was open. I was sure it had been closed earlier, but now it was wide open. My stomach dropped as I realized that someone could have easily climbed up from the fire escape and entered my apartment. Just then, the security guard from the building arrived. He did a thorough check of the apartment and the fire escape, but he didn't find anything unusual. He assured me that the fire escape was secure now and suggested I stay alert, as there had been a few reports of petty thefts in the building recently. After the security guard left, I struggled to get back to sleep. I kept the lights on and stayed in the living room, listening for any unusual noises. I didn't hear anything else that night, but the sense of vulnerability lingered. The next day, I went to check the locks and security measures on all the windows and doors. I had a locksmith come over to install more secure locks on the windows and the escape door. I also signed up for a new security system with cameras, just to be safe. I'm still shaken by what happened. It's disconcerting to think that someone could have been trying to get into my apartment or that the building might have security issues I wasn't aware of. I've become much more cautious and check the locks on my doors and windows more frequently. One final thing I thought I should add. I've not been able to find 2 of my knives for the past month. I had a set of 5 large knives that were always either in the sink or on the stand, and I can't find them anywhere. They weren't exactly expensive, so I don't see why anyone would take them, but there's no way I've just misplaced them. This is a follow-up to the story that I sent to Mr. Chilling last week about the unsettling night I had while home alone with my dog, Charlie. I wish I could say it was just a figment of my imagination, but it turns out there was something far more sinister going on. I'm sharing this because I need to make sense of it all and warn others. After that night, I was still on edge, and I'd been extra vigilant about locking doors and windows. I decided to have a security system installed just to be safe. The following Monday, a technician came over to set it up. While he was installing the cameras and sensors, I mentioned the strange noises and Charlie's odd behavior. He listened carefully and assured me that having a security system was a good move. A few days later, I received a notification on my phone from the security system app. It was a motion alert from a camera in the hallway. I was at work, so I opened the app to see the live feed. I nearly dropped my phone when I saw what was on the screen. A person, dressed in dark clothing, moving around my living room. They were clearly trying to be stealthy, but the camera captured their every move. I immediately called the police and told them what was going on. I was frantic, trying to get them to understand the urgency of the situation. They told me they'd send someone over right away and instructed me to stay put and not return home until they gave the all clear. It felt like hours before the police arrived at my house, though it was only about 20 minutes. They checked the footage and then went inside to investigate. I was waiting outside, pacing nervously and trying to keep my mind occupied. When the officers came back out, they had some troubling news. The intruder had indeed been inside. They had accessed several rooms, including the kitchen and the living room, where they had moved a few things around. They didn't seem to have taken anything significant, which was puzzling. The police found no signs of forced entry, and it appeared that the intruder had either entered through a window that wasn't properly locked or had found another way inside. The police collected fingerprints and took a detailed statement from me. They also checked the entire house for any potential security breaches or overlooked evidence. They advised me to review the security footage carefully to see if I could identify anything that might help them catch the person responsible. The footage showed the intruder moving through the house, but their face was obscured by a hood and mask. They seemed to be methodical, checking various rooms as if looking for something specific. The most chilling part was seeing them approach the door to my bedroom while Charlie was asleep on the other side. Fortunately, they didn't enter the bedroom, but the fact that they were so close to where I was sleeping made my skin crawl. In the days that followed, the police didn't have any new leads. They continued to investigate, but there were no further updates. I installed additional security measures, including better locks and motion sensor lights around the property. I've also made sure to keep in touch with the police regularly to check if there are any new developments. Charlie and I are still adjusting to the new normal. The sense of safety I once had in my home is gone, replaced by a constant awareness of our surroundings. I try to stay as vigilant as possible, and Charlie seems to be more on edge than before, likely sensing the residual tension. If there's any lesson I've learned, it's not to underestimate the importance of security and awareness. I'm grateful for the security system and the police response, but I can't help but feel unsettled, knowing that someone was in my home without my knowledge. If anyone has experienced something similar or has advice on staying safe after an intruder has been in your home, I'd appreciate hearing from you. This happened just last week, and I've been uneasy ever since. I'm sharing this here because I can't shake the feeling of dread that night left me with. My name is Sarah, and I live alone with my dog, Charlie. He's a large, friendly Labrador who's usually my constant companion. Last Friday night, I was home alone and winding down after a long day. I'd spent the evening watching TV and reading a book, and around 9 p.m., I decided to get an early night. Charlie and I headed to bed, and he curled up beside me as usual. Everything seemed normal until around 11 p.m. when Charlie suddenly started growling. It was a low, angry growl, and it got louder and more intense. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. He was staring intently at the door to the hallway. I got up and went to check, but everything seemed quiet. I assumed Charlie was just being protective, so I tried to reassure him and went back to bed. I figured it was probably just some noise outside that had startled him. But Charlie was restless. He kept pacing around the room, occasionally letting out low growls. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise that made me freeze. It sounded like someone was moving around in the house. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or maybe the wind. But then Charlie's growling turned into barking. I could hear him scratching at the door, desperate to get out. I grabbed a flashlight and went into the hallway. The house was silent again, but the feeling of unease was growing stronger. I checked the front and back doors to make sure they were locked. Everything seemed secure. I then looked through the windows, but there was nothing unusual outside, just the darkness of the night. Back in my bedroom, Charlie was now whining and pawing at the door. I let him out of the room and followed him, trying to figure out what was wrong. As we walked through the house, I noticed a few small things that were out of place, a chair that had been moved in the kitchen, and a picture frame that had fallen off the wall. It didn't make sense, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Charlie led me to the living room, where he started sniffing around the couch and growling again. The room was dark, and the only light came from the flashlight I was holding. I scanned the room, but there was nothing obvious. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and my skin was crawling. I decided to stay in the living room with Charlie. I turned on all the lights and sat on the couch, trying to stay calm. Charlie eventually settled down next to me, but he kept his head up, watching the door intently. The rest of the night was tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and every creak or shift in the house made me jump. Eventually, the noises and Charlie's agitation subsided, and I managed to get a few hours of restless sleep on the couch with Charlie beside me. When the morning came, I checked the house again. Everything appeared normal, no signs of forced entry or anything out of place. I've tried to rationalize it as a mix of a bad night and Charlie's heightened senses, but the fact that things were moved and the sense of unease remains with me. Charlie's behavior was completely out of character, and I can't explain why he was so agitated. I'm still on edge, and I double-check the locks and windows every night. This happened just a few days ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm sharing this because I need to get it out there. My name's Emily, and my older brother, Matt, and I were home alone last Friday night. My parents had gone out for dinner and a movie, and since Matt was in town for a few days, we decided to take advantage of the quiet house. It was around 7 p.m. when they left, and we were both excited to have some time to ourselves. We decided to order pizza and watch movies, something we hadn't done in a while. We set up in the living room with blankets and snacks, just enjoying the peace and quiet. The night started off perfectly. We watched a couple of action movies, joked around, and ate way too much pizza. Around 10 p.m., we heard a strange noise from the kitchen. It sounded like something metallic had fallen. We both looked at each other, confused, and Matt went to check it out. He came back a minute later, saying he found nothing and that it was probably just a pan falling from the hook or something. We laughed it off and continued our movie marathon, but the noise from earlier kept nagging at me. The feeling of being watched crept in, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. As the night went on, the atmosphere in the house started to feel different, almost oppressive. The air seemed heavier, and the usual creaks of the old house seemed louder. By 11 p.m., Matt was getting tired and decided to head to bed. I stayed up to finish the movie. It was around midnight when the TV suddenly went black. I thought it was a power outage at first, but then I noticed that all the lights in the house flickered and went out. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight and went to check the fuse box. It was odd because the fuse box was fine. There was no sign of any problem. As I walked back to the living room, I heard the front door creak open. I froze. Our front door is always locked, and my parents had told me repeatedly to make sure it stayed locked when they weren't home. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I crept toward the door. When I reached it, I saw it was slightly ajar, but no one was outside. I pulled the door shut, locked it, and checked the back door just to be sure. Everything seemed okay. I went back to the living room and tried to call Matt to see if he was awake, but he didn't answer. I figured he was asleep and just ignored my calls. I decided to call my parents, but my phone suddenly died. It was odd because it had been fully charged earlier. With no way to contact anyone, I decided to wait in the living room. I tried to stay calm, but every little sound made me jump. The silence was unnerving. I sat there for what felt like hours until I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. My heart raced again. I knew Matt was in bed, but these footsteps sounded heavier, like they were coming from someone else. I grabbed a flashlight and went upstairs, feeling every step as if it might be my last. The house felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch out in every direction. I reached Matt's room and found him asleep, completely unaware of what was going on downstairs. I shook him awake and told him about the door and the noises. He seemed groggy but agreed to check the house with me. We went through each room carefully, checking for anything out of place. We found nothing unusual, but the feeling of dread was still there. We locked all the doors and decided to stay in Matt's room until our parents came home. We set up a makeshift bed on the floor and tried to sleep, but neither of us got much rest. When my parents finally got home at 1 a.m., they were confused about why the house was so dark. We told them everything that happened, and they checked the house thoroughly. They couldn't find anything amiss and reassured us that it was probably just a series of coincidences. They suggested it might have been a faulty fuse. Since then, I've been feeling uneasy every time I'm home alone. The whole experience left me on edge, and I can't shake the feeling that something was off that night. I'm hoping it was just our minds playing tricks on us, but I can't deny how strange and unsettling it all was. If anyone has any ideas about what might have happened, I'd appreciate hearing them. This happened a few hours ago, and I'm still on edge. I want to share what happened because I need to get it off my chest. I was home alone with my best friend Jake. It's a common thing when he visits. We end up spending time together while my parents are out. We usually head to the woods behind my house for some lighthearted fun, but tonight, things went sideways. It was around 4:30 p.m. when we decided to head out. The sun was still up, but the clouds were thick, and the air had a chill to it. We walked down the familiar path from my house to the woods. The leaves rustled under our feet, and the smell of pine filled the air. As we made our way, we joked around and talked about school. The path was usually easy to navigate, but today it felt different, like the woods were somehow denser, as if they were closing in around us. We reached the edge of the forest and pushed through the underbrush. We had this routine: we'd find some rocks, throw them into the creek, and break some sticks for fun. Everything seemed normal until we started walking deeper into the woods. The sky was getting darker, faster than usual, and the trees seemed taller and thicker, blocking out more light. About 15 minutes into our walk, we heard something odd. It was a strange scratching noise coming from behind us. We stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there. We shrugged it off as an animal and continued. But the feeling of unease started to sink in. As we went further in, the usual sounds of birds and critters seemed to vanish. It was oddly silent, and the only noise was the crunch of leaves under our feet. Jake and I both noticed it, but neither of us said anything. We just kept walking, trying to shake off the discomfort. Eventually, we stumbled upon something strange. A tattered old Barbie doll lying face down in the dirt. Its clothes were faded and torn, and it had an arm missing. It looked like it had been there for years. We exchanged uneasy glances and moved on, trying to laugh it off. Our plan was to go further in than we ever had before. We figured we'd explore a bit more and then head back. As we ventured deeper, we came across the remains of what looked like a makeshift campsite. There were some burnt-out logs and a few pieces of broken furniture scattered around. It felt weird and a little unsettling, but we decided to press on. After walking for a while, we reached a spot I recognized, a bridge made from a fallen log that spanned a narrow river. It was the farthest I'd ever been in the woods. I'd seen it before, but tonight it looked different. There was something small and white on top of the bridge. As we approached, we saw it was a deer skull, perfectly clean and eerily out of place. We both felt a shiver. The skull was positioned in the middle of the bridge, as if it was placed there deliberately. Jake suggested we turn back, but I wanted to keep going. I figured we were almost done with our adventure. On the other side of the river, there was a big hill with a small house on top. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and a roof full of holes. While we were looking at the house, we heard a loud creak coming from that direction. It sounded like it came from inside the house or somewhere nearby. The noise was sharp and unsettling. We both froze, and then Jake whispered that he thought he saw a shadow move inside the house. That's when we both decided it was time to leave. We ran as fast as we could, back toward the edge of the woods. My heart was racing, and I could hear Jake behind me, breathing heavily. I also heard him scream suddenly. When I stopped to check on him, he told me he heard footsteps right next to him. It was like someone was walking beside him, but when he looked, no one was there. We finally reached the road and sprinted back to my house. As we approached, we noticed the garage door was open. We had no idea if we'd left it like that or if something else was going on. We hurried inside, locked the door, and checked the whole house. I turned on the alarm and made sure all the windows and doors were secure. It's been almost 2 hours since we got home, and we're still feeling on edge. I keep thinking about the deer skull and the noises from the house on the hill. I'm hoping this is just a weird memory, but the fear from tonight is hard to shake. If anyone has any idea what could have caused that strange feeling or those noises, please let me know. I just hope we never have to go back there again. When I was 19, I was a Marine and had stupidly used my military perks to get a home loan and bought my first house. I moved a barracks room worth of stuff into this place that seemed to me like a palace. Of course, I went out and bought some bar stools, a futon to sleep on until I got to bed, and some used coffee tables for my TV. I also had my dog with me. As I unpacked my meager belongings in the living room, I noticed a car had pulled into my drive and blocked me in. I walked out, and there stood a man offering to sell me a home security system. The man was dressed in khakis and a polo with a name tag that I can't recall, and the car didn't have a logo on it. It should have been a red flag for me, but I figured that some people on the job didn't drive company vehicles. He gave me his card, but I don't even remember the name of the company he told me he was representing. Cue the friendly salesman, giving me his pitch about needing a system and all the perks that would come with being able to watch the exterior of my house at any time. As a low-ranking military member, I knew I couldn't afford yet another thing, so my mind was working to try to get this man to go away. I even considered ninja chopping him or whatever it is that we Marines do in hand-to-hand just to get him to leave. But I'm a sort of passive person. I'm too nice. Nah, let's call it polite. I won't be rude to someone doing their job. I've been in customer service. I can relate. I tried politely declining his offer after he had tried to show me some stuff on his iPad, but you know how persistent these types are. I'll admit to my own stupidity when answering his questions, like giving out too much information. Do you live alone? No, I live here with my wife and our 3 large dogs. At least I had it in the large part. Her and her dogs hadn't actually moved in yet, and hers were just fat, though they were more vicious than my own good boy. But 2 women living together probably seemed like easier targets. I also mentioned being a Marine when he asked. He seemed a bit shocked, but wouldn't be deterred. What kind of security system do you have? My dogs and me. Not the best answer I could have given. I wasn't exactly intimidating. I mean, I would be terrifying if I had a gun or something. I've been using them all my life, and I've never missed a target, alive or inanimate. If you would invite me in, I can show you the best places to set up cameras, he mentioned more than a few times. Each time made me more and more creeped out, thinking that he was wanting to potentially rob me, not that there was much to take. Despite being a victim of assault in the past, all I could consider was a possible burglary and made sure we stayed away from my house while we talked. We were outside for about 15 minutes total, me spending most of that time trying to politely get away from him and retreat inside. I was losing my mind with the social niceties and just walked away, leaving him standing alone in my front yard. I walked into my house and locked the door. He got into his car and left. I thought nothing more of it. After some unpacking, I couldn't do much. I had nowhere to put most of it. I ate some junk food and put together the futon. I got it all decked out with my fluffiest blankets, made sure the doors and windows were locked, and went to lay down in the living room. Looking back, I'm not sure why I didn't put it in a bedroom. They all have blinds, and the rooms take a bit of getting to. Perhaps I wanted to be near an exit. For some context, my back door is a double glass pane door. At the time, I didn't have curtains on it, but I did have blinds on the kitchen window. My kitchen, living room, and dining room are all connected, but there's a wall in the living room that I strategically situated my futon against so it couldn't be seen by the back doors or the front door window. Call me paranoid. I had been laying down for a few hours, and at about 11, my dog got off the futon and went to the back doors. My dog is large and looks like a Rottweiler, but he's never hurt anything in his life. He'll greet strangers at the door with a tail wag and hardly barks. He stood back there for a bit and whined a few times. I ignored him, it was probably a squirrel. But then he started growling, a sound that I'll never forget. It sent terror straight through me as I sat alone in the dark. I had only ever felt that fear once, when a mountain lion screamed, and I realized I was powerless against nature. The point is, these sounds are designed to scare you. And it petrified me. I was frozen and wanted to wimp out, to hide, to call the cops, but I realized if someone was out there, they'd for sure see my phone light and know where I was. So while my dog stayed stationed at the back door, I talked myself up just enough to move off the couch and investigate, still scared out of my mind. I slunk to the kitchen and grabbed a kitchen knife, one of the only utensils I had, and crept to the kitchen window. I was squatting amongst the cabinets so that I couldn't be seen from any windows, trying to gear up to peel back the blinds. My brain was telling me irrational things, horror stories that I had read come to life. To be real, I was ready to punk out. I'm not a brave person. I was in communications for God's sake. Pretty far from any life-threatening situation, while not one that involves people at my house. In the one space that I should consider safe. My hideout, my protection from anything outside wanting in. I've always been afraid of home invasion. It stems from an incident when I was younger that isn't really worth mentioning further. Point is, if someone dares enter my safe place, it's not safe anymore. I thought I couldn't get more scared in that moment, but then I saw a male figure in my backyard, and my heart jumped out of my chest. He wasn't very far from the window I was looking out of. He was bold enough to not wear anything over his head, and I saw the blonde hair in the moonlight. It only took me a few seconds to recognize the security salesman in the dark. He was on the edge of my porch, watching my back door. Watching my dog. I jumped up quickly, climbed over the bar counter, and turned on the lights as I went towards the back door to let my still growling dog out in hopes that he'd at least get rid of the man, if not injure him. No dice. As soon as the lights came on, he had just enough time to go jump the low part of the fence to safety before my dog even got off the porch. I didn't sleep that night. My dog sat on the futon with me, calm as could be, having done his job. The next morning, I filed a police report, but I couldn't tell them his name or what company he was with, having lost the car he gave me. They sent some patrols through the area, and I found out that all legit salesmen should have an ID upon request. That night, I had 2 friends stay with me, ready for him to come back. We thought he might have set the whole thing up to scare me into buying home security. He didn't come back, and I haven't seen him since. This happened yesterday while both of my parents were at work. For context, my dad's a mailman and my mom is an RV saleswoman. They're always on their feet, so neither can pick up their phone very quickly. I do have an older brother, but he's at college 2 hours away, so he doesn't matter in this story. I was sitting in the living room with my dog when I heard people talking in the hallway. This isn't unusual because I live in a 3rd-floor apartment and there's a noisy family next door that brings over friends a lot. This was also a Saturday, so I wasn't expecting complete silence. I obviously just ignored the talking since it's not that loud, and I had headphones on. But my dog perked up and walked towards the door with an alert posture. The hair on his back was sticking up, which he never usually does. So I got concerned and took my headphones out. This is when I heard the voices from before, which were 2 adult men yelling very loudly in the apartment hallway. I got a bit freaked out, so I pushed my dog away from the door, made sure it was locked, and crept towards it to make sure they weren't near my place. When I looked out, I couldn't see either of them, and because the only blind spot in my peephole is directly to the right, I knew they were at my neighbor's. As I'm leaning against it, my whole front door starts shaking because the men are banging on the neighbor's door and still yelling things like, "We can hear you," and "Come out." But I didn't want to show that I was home. At this point, I grabbed my dog and pulled him into my room while I tried to call my dad, who luckily picked up after a few rings. He told me that I should just stay in my room and stay quiet, and that they would go away. I did stay in my room for the most part, but I called my best friend just to have someone on the phone because my dad couldn't stay talking to me. My room is the furthest from the door, so they definitely wouldn't have heard me whispering to my friend about the situation. After about 5 minutes, I stopped hearing the banging. I told my friend I was gonna check if I could hear anything. When I got out there, I didn't hear the banging anymore, so I moved closer to listen. I looked out of the peephole and I could see one of them pacing. I freaked out again and started creeping back to my room. That's when I heard one of them say, "Maybe we got the wrong house." This threw me into a full-blown panic attack. Since my identical apartment door is 5 feet away from my neighbor's and all the others are down a hallway, if they didn't even know the exact number and they obviously weren't scared to bang on an apartment door so aggressively, they would probably come to my door. So, again, I pulled my dog into my brother's room since it had a lock, and I camped in there. I waited for about 10 minutes before I heard the banging calm down again. I couldn't hear any talking from my position. I was texting my friend, who also lived in the complex, about what was happening. That's when the banging started again, but this time they moved to my door. They went through the same routine, but they were much more aggressive. I could hear them slamming, kicking, and hitting my door, all while yelling for some guy to come out. I called my brother later, and he told me there's no way he could have been involved in this, especially because he's 19, and those men had to have been at least 25. I called my dad again, and in his panic, he told me to go out of the room and tell them there's no guys in the apartment, that I'm just a girl. But I just told him I'm gonna call the cops. I know they weren't just looking to break down a door, and that they were targeting this guy who did them dirty. But I still didn't want to go out there because one, even if they're looking for someone else, I don't know if they have weapons, and in their enraged state, they might just cause harm. But they still have the info on me, which leads me to number 2. I'm a high school freshman girl, 5'4", and less than 100 pounds. Quite frankly, I have no fight in me. For example, I'm terrified of knives, so I brought a bowling pin for my room for protection instead. Plus, I was in the middle of a panic attack. I stood no chance against 2 adult men at my door, so letting them know I'm a teen girl home alone isn't the best idea. I sat next to my locked bedroom door with my dog as I called the cops. I tried to keep him quiet this whole time, but I didn't want to be suspicious during this situation. I made sure not to talk to my friend while I was out of the room to keep quiet and tiptoe everywhere so they didn't know anyone was home besides the dog. I'm pretty sure they didn't know anyone was home, even though they said, "We know you're in there," during their yells. Because earlier, they were unsure if they even had the right place. I was on the phone with the cops for a few minutes before I heard light knocking at my door, making me realize I wasn't so much in shock that I didn't even know the banging had stopped. The operator said it was the cops, so I ended the call and answered the door. The officers told me the guys took off just before they got there, and they asked me a few questions about male family members and if they could have any correlation with this. I want to share a story about the time my family's house got broken into. It was a really creepy experience. It happened one dark October evening while I was in high school. Back then, whenever I got home from school, I would go up to my room and lie on my bed and read some comics. On the day of the break-in, it was just me in the house. My family had gone shopping, so I shut myself in my room and lost myself in my books. It was great. I needed the toilet though, so I left my room, and that's when I noticed something strange. The smell of tobacco smoke. This was really weird since I don't smoke, and no one in my family does either. I'd never smelled this smell before in my house, so I went in search of the source of the smell. I began my search in my little sister's room as I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open and switched on the light, and in my little sister's room was a full-grown man. There was a stranger in our house. He was holding his shoes in one hand, and he was rummaging through my sister's drawers with his other hand. I guessed that he had taken off his shoes so that he could move around more quietly. My heart stopped, and my skin went as cold as ice. Somehow I managed to ask, "What are you doing in here?" Despite my fear, he started babbling, creating random excuses, none of which were plausible. It was really crazy. My heart was racing now, and I didn't know what to do, so I just grabbed him by the arm. I didn't want him to escape, and he didn't resist or complain. He kept silent. Luckily, my grandfather lived close by, so I led the intruder with me to his house. When we got there, my grandfather called the police. After some time, the police arrived, and they filled us in on the details. After they interviewed him, it turns out that the man lived in one of the apartments across the street that looked directly into our house. Things got really creepy when he told the police that he'd been in our home several times. He said he liked to break in even when there were people in the house. Despite the police interview, the man broke down and confessed. He said the main purpose of his repeated trespassing was the fact that he was drawn to my sister. He had some sort of obsession with her. He told the police that the day I apprehended him, he was looking for some of her underwear to take back to his apartment. He said that the only reason he'd pick my sister was due to the simple fact that she was his type. He confessed to entering other people's homes too, anyone who was his type. He said that the only reason he went unnoticed by the occupants was that he was very careful not to disturb anything or steal a thing. No one knew he was coming or going. It seemed that this guy had an understanding of our family's movements, our schedules, that kind of thing. It was clear that he'd been watching our house and our family for a long time. He knew how to get in easily, must have searched for a weak point of entry. He had done this many times without being caught, and my guess was that he began to get careless, which was how I was able to catch him. I only caught him due to the cigarette smell. I can't tell you how horrifying it is to find someone standing in a dark room in your house when you're at that age. I literally have no words for how frightened I was. Of course, we threw away all of my sister's underwear. We decided to get her new clothes. I mean, how could she feel comfortable wearing anything that man had touched? I think my sister has suffered mentally with this, and it's a thing I don't speak to her about. I'm just glad I caught him. Who knows what else he might have tried doing. Maybe stealing the clothes was just the beginning. I don't want to think about it. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out. I had no plans and really nothing I needed to do. On Monday, I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seemed worse every time. The trees looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak non-stop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games and played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up, but then I remembered the fact there was a storm happening. Who would be outside right now? I went over to the front door and looked through the peephole, but nothing. I opened the door. The wind and rain hit me right away, but when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rung the doorbell. I don't know, it sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard. It sounded like stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside, pushing each piece of furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked at the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room this time, just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground right next to the couch. Then I saw another and another, leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and downstairs, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind, what if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden and called. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seems like a personal attack because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have at that moment. After some thought, this had led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come from my roommates. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left, doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they had. This happened last year while I was 17, and it's something I will never forget. I was home alone one weekend while my parents were at a work convention out of state. I was upstairs in my room playing Rocket League with two of my friends, talking to them on my headset when I heard a thump from downstairs. This wasn't unusual because I have two cats who often make a lot of noise while wrestling with each other. So, I resumed my game while turning down the TV slightly to check if the noise persisted. About 2 minutes later, I heard another thump, followed by what sounded like a grunt. I told my friends about the thumps, and they urged me to check it out, so I did. I began my walk downstairs, thinking my cats were wrestling rougher than usual. But as I got halfway down the stairs, I froze. I could hear what sounded like men whispering to each other coming from the living room. Crouching down to get a small peek into the living room, I saw 3 large men covered in all black, walking around. I can't describe the feeling in my chest when I saw this. Slowly crawling up the stairs from my crouched position in typical horror movie fashion, the very last step made a very loud creak. The entire house was silent now, and I knew they heard it. Thinking on my feet, I ran quietly to my room, threw on my headset, and told my friends to call the cops and send them to my house. They sounded confused and asked what was going on, but I just urged them to hurry and threw my headset on my bed. As I got to my door to close it, I heard 2 sets of footsteps coming up the stairs. I knew if I locked myself in my room, they would know where I was. So I closed my door and snuck over to my parents' room, purposely leaving the door open so they wouldn't think to check it. About 5 seconds later, I heard a pair of heavy boots hit the wooden upstairs floor, accompanied by another set of footsteps. They got louder as they came down the hall and stopped by my door. I heard pounding on my bedroom door, followed by a deep voice saying, "Open up," before I ran this door down. I got chills hearing this. I made a break for my parents' bedroom window and slid it open quietly, but I must not have been quiet enough because I heard heavy boots go further down the hallway. As I was halfway through the window, a man came into view from the doorway and yelled as he ran towards me. At this point, I jumped out the window, and the man grabbed my ankles, trying to lift me back up. Luckily, I wiggled my feet enough to slip out of my shoes and onto the small roof above my back door. The man followed me out the window as the other man came to the window. I panicked and jumped off the roof, landing awkwardly on my left ankle. The commotion upstairs caused the third man, still downstairs, to spot me through the porch window and run outside to chase me down. I made it to the backyard gate, limping on one foot, before the man grabbed me and pulled me back into the yard. I tried to yell, but the man covered my mouth as the other 2 men climbed down from the window. All 3 of the men grabbed me and tried pulling me back into the house. As they got me in the house, I heard the relieving sound of police sirens pulling up. The men looked at each other and said, "Shit," before pushing me to the ground and fleeing out the back door. Limping on my one leg to the front door, I yanked it open and yelled that the men were in the backyard. 3 officers ran into the backyard while 1 officer helped me over to one of the police cars. They only caught 1 of the men, while the other 2 escaped over the fence. They threw the man into the other car as the officers came to question me. Shortly after, my 2 friends, whom I was playing with, pulled into the driveway on their bikes and rushed over to me to see if I was all right. I told them I was okay and thanked them for calling the police, potentially saving my life. The man that was caught was charged with burglary and attempted kidnapping. It turns out the men broke in through the basement window. I was thankful to escape with my life and only a sprained ankle that night. My lesson to all is to always follow your gut and never ignore any sound you hear while home alone. When I was 20 years old, I came back home for summer break from college. My good friend Becky and her boyfriend had just found new jobs. They had a house all to themselves, sitting at the top of a very steep hill. A bit about Becky: she gets really nervous and anxious all the time. I get anxious too, but I've gotten used to living by myself and dealing with my worries. But she wasn't used to it at all. Their house had a back door in the kitchen. If you were sitting on the sofa in the living room, you could see straight into the kitchen. Right outside the kitchen door, about as high as your shoulder, there was a light that turned on when there was any movement. It's important to mention that Becky's backyard was pretty high up. To get into the yard from the low walkway in front of the door, you had to go up a few steps. The yard was made this way so it wrapped around to the front of the house. Becky was by herself because her boyfriend was working his first or second night shift and she couldn't fall asleep. They were trying to save money, so all the lights were off. Then, she saw a light come through the kitchen window. It was the motion-sensing light. This really scared her, but she tried to just ignore it. However, the light kept turning itself on at different times. So, this motion-sensing light would only turn on if something moved on the walkway, not for any animals in the yard. The yard itself was tiny, with thick wood stretching down from the end of it. She called me early at about 3 a.m. until I finally picked up. I talked to her on the phone, trying to calm her down until her boyfriend came back in the morning. He had the next 3 days off, and nothing happened with the light during that time. Her dad warned her to be careful, suggesting it might have been thieves checking out the house, especially since there had been some break-ins recently on a street close to hers. The next time her boyfriend had to work at night, Becky asked if I could stay over. I said yes. The evening started off pretty normally. We watched movies until about 11. Then, we decided to drive out to the nearest shop and grab some food from McDonald's. Where we live, it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere, so getting there and back took us almost an hour and a half. We got home around midnight and set up the air mattress in the living room where we planned to sleep. Around 1 a.m., that motion-sensing light outside turned on while we were sitting on the mattress. I tried to calm her down by saying it was probably just an animal, maybe a bat or something flying by. Becky wasn't so sure. The light went off, but then it came on again. This time it stayed on longer. Becky decided to go upstairs and get her boyfriend's gun. We sat there, really nervous, with the window open so we could hear outside. She joked around, shouting, "I've got a gun, and I'm not afraid to use it." She was trying to make me laugh, but right after she said that, the light turned off. It stayed off for about 3 hours, as if we had scared someone away. We couldn't sleep after that. Around 4 in the morning, I went to the kitchen to get some water. When I turned around to say something to Becky, she suddenly screamed for me to come back. I spun around, and the light was on again. We saw the light turn on and off several times until the dawn began to break. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We thought about calling the police, but were worried they might think we were making a prank call and we'd get in trouble. The light never seems to act up when her boyfriend is home at night. I still feel really uneasy being alone at her place during the night. I'm sure someone was up to no good that night, whether they planned to break in and found it amusing to scare us once they realized the house wasn't empty, or if they had even worse plans. It was a terrifying experience. Back in 2012, I sat down with my girlfriend, and after 18 months of dating, I told her my family's deepest, darkest secret. 3 weeks later, I came home from work to find all of her stuff gone and a breakup letter sitting on the kitchen table. I learned not to talk to anyone but my sister about it, but I also feel like if I don't get this stuff off my chest from time to time, it'll just eat me alive from the inside out. I've survived this long by talking to therapists, but at this point, I view therapy like atheists view confessional booths, a nice novelty but inconsequential. The internet, on the other hand, is an altogether different beast. I can remain anonymous, and strangers online can give their opinions. And just like it allows me to say things I'd never tell a person face to face, it allows you to give me your full and unfettered opinions, as brutal as they may be. But I'm okay with that, and that's why I'm writing this. Because I don't want absolution, I want judgment. I was 12 years old at the time of my discovery, and all summer I had this one all-consuming obsession, Pokemon Red. I put hours into catching and training all the original 150 Pokemon. Then, when I beat the Elite Four and completed my Pokédex, I just deleted my save and started all over again. By showing that I loved playing Pokemon so much, I gave my parents a way of punishing me whenever I misbehaved. They were great parents to me for the most part, and my frequent misdeeds were mostly harmless. But whenever I failed to do my chores, or was rude to my sister, their go-to confiscation item was my Game Boy. It'd go like this: they'd hide my Game Boy somewhere, but I'd always find it, then get caught playing it and have it taken away again. This meant that I spent a lot of time snooping around their bedroom and my dad's office. Since it was still summer vacation, I had plenty of time to do it. It was during one of my little searching sessions that I discovered my dad had a secret space hidden away in his office. He normally kept it locked, but during one afternoon snooping, I found the key in his office. My dad had this big old antique cabinet that he kept all kinds of junk in, and I knew he sometimes hid my Game Boy in it. So after having no luck elsewhere, I began to search it. I remember sticking my hand into one of the bottom cabinets, leaning in just a little too hard, and then I heard a dull crunch of wood as the rear wall of the cabinet suddenly gave way. When I looked, hoping I hadn't broken it, I saw that there was a small hidden compartment. Due to the dim light, the only thing I recognized at first was the gun. But there was also something that looked like a letter and, more importantly, something shaped like my Game Boy. I reached out to grab it, but as soon as I touched it, I realized it wasn't what I was looking for. It felt leathery, not the plastic I was used to, and as curiosity got the better of me, I pulled it out of the hidey hole to see what it was. It was a journal, this old-looking leather-bound journal. When I opened it up, I recognized my dad's handwriting. I might have recognized his handwriting, but I definitely didn't understand most of what was written. The entries were clearly dated, but what followed was an unintelligible mess of abbreviations, words, and phrases. There were also these little hand-drawn diagrams of what looked like beds along with stick men that had their limbs contorted into unnatural positions. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I just knew from the fact that it was hidden that it was some secret side of Dad that he didn't show us. I was so filled with grim curiosity that I felt compelled to check out the other stuff. First came the gun. It was much heavier than they looked in the movies, and it was much scarier. I held it like it was made of glass, not even daring to touch the trigger. I then put it back as slowly and carefully as I could. I saved the thing that looked like an envelope until last. I figured that it would be sealed, but after retrieving it, I saw that it wasn't an envelope at all. It was one of those plastic wallets that 1-hour photograph developers give you, the kind that house all your photos and negatives tucked inside. I figured that it might be pictures of my family since those are the only kind I've ever seen come out of a wallet like that. But the only member of my family present in the pictures was my dad, and this version of him was unlike any I'd ever known. The first few pictures were of a bed, somewhere I didn't recognize. It didn't look all that remarkable at first, but then I noticed the rope tied around the bedposts, and that bad feeling I had started to intensify. The next few pictures were of a bunch of tools all laid out on a wooden table, but I noticed a few other things mixed in with them. There was a hammer, a hand drill, a pair of metal pliers, all home improvement stuff, but there was also a scalpel and other surgical-looking tools that looked so sharp they made me wince. The next photographs I saw were of my dad, but like I said earlier, there was something really off about him. He'd taken some pictures of himself, but he seemed to be particularly interested in the way his eyes looked, as some were close-up shots of them. I don't know why he didn't just take a look at them in the mirror, but then again, I had no idea why Dad was doing any of this stuff, let alone why he wanted to hide it from us. When I saw the next picture, I got this intense feeling of dread and knew that I was looking at something he'd never want his family to see. I figured the first person in the selfie was my dad, but the face was covered by a kind of cloth sack made of black wire mesh, so I couldn't be 100% sure. Assuming that he could see out of it, there was no good reason why my dad would want to cover his face up like that. There was also no good reason why he'd want to use it as a blindfold, and the thought of him doing something like that filled me with dread. But then, when it came to the next few pictures, that feeling was replaced by one of confusion. The pictures showed a young Asian man smiling as he posed next to an art installation somewhere downtown. The next picture was of my dad smiling next to the same art piece. I didn't recognize the guy, but I did think it was odd that he looked way younger than my dad. The happy vibe continued for a few other photos. There were pictures of them drinking together at a bar. Pictures of the Asian guy looking like he was dancing. It was all smiles in all the pictures. Suddenly, the vibe of the photos changed dramatically. In the next picture, he was standing awkwardly with his arms by his sides, with a look of slight fear on his face. The next few showed him tied to the bed. He was looking up at the camera, and the terror on his face was even more pronounced. The final picture showed a man in that cloth mask leaning over the guy. I couldn't see what they were doing, but the guy's legs were all tensed up and pulling on the ropes that bound them, almost like he was in an intense amount of pain. I remember having an incredible visceral reaction to that last picture, so after shoving the photos back into the wallet, I tried to put everything back into the little hidey hole exactly as I'd found it. After that, I abandoned the search for my Game Boy, locked up my dad's office, and spent the rest of the afternoon in my bedroom, swinging back and forth between thinking about what I'd seen and trying to forget about it altogether. When my dad got home from work, he just figured that I was angry at him for confiscating my Game Boy. Only my mom realized that there was something deeper going on, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. If I did, it would be the end of my family as I knew it, so I just kept my mouth shut. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk to someone about the pictures, I just didn't know how to do it without some kind of familial apocalypse. Besides, I wasn't even sure what I'd actually been looking at. I tried to pretend that I hadn't seen anything, but my relationship with my dad was never the same afterward. All I could do when I saw his face was picture him in those photos, wondering what the hell he was doing to that poor unsuspecting guy. I assumed Mom knew nothing about what my dad had been doing in those photographs, and I felt incredibly sorry for her. But at the same time, I was burdened with the horrific guilt of being the only one who could warn her, but not being capable of it. After that, I hoped to God that he wouldn't question me further, and I prayed to hear the sound of the door closing behind him. But the seconds went by, and the door didn't close. He just stood there, staring at the back of my head, saying nothing. Doing nothing. When he asked me if I was sure, I just kept my eyes locked on the screen and gave him the most nonchalant denial I could muster. Those were some of the scariest few moments of my whole life, and even when the door finally closed, I was terrified that he'd be standing there waiting to have a private talk with me. He wasn't, which was obviously a huge relief, but as I got back to my game, I started to wonder if he had actually taken me at my word. Then the day came when he walked into my bedroom and asked me the one question I'd been dreading for almost a year. When he asked if I'd been in his office recently, the words sent a chill through me. Thankfully, I learned to hide my emotions very well, so without looking up from playing Sega, I just flatly told him no. Then, like a bullet between the eyes, it hit me. Some minor detail from almost 2 years ago came rushing back into focus. After the dread got too much for me, I just shoved the photos back into the wallet. What I hadn't done was rearrange them back into their original order. Someone who really knew those photographs, someone who put them together, would know exactly which order they were in. This was obviously a huge problem for me, but as I continued to think on it, I realized something. He couldn't actually accuse me of looking at the pictures. He couldn't just outright accuse anyone because if they weren't the guilty party, they'd know that he'd been hiding something. That little detail was the only thing that saved me from God knows what, for years. With time, the whole thing kind of faded into the background. It was always still there. But the idea of my mom finding out about the pictures, of seeing all the heartbreak and the shame in her, I just couldn't let that happen. Don't get me wrong, I was in almost constant terror of my dad hurting us, but with each day that passed, it grew easier to reassure myself that we were fine. The next time the photos seriously got into my head, I was in my second year of college. I was on the opposite side of the country, studying at USC as far as my grades could take me. Moving away came with a fresh helping of guilt. I felt like I abandoned my mom and sister to whoever my dad truly was, or at least used to be. I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd spent 6 years swinging between anxiety and depression, and it had been years since he found out someone had found his little hidey hole, as I call it. If he was going to murder us all in our sleep, I figured that he'd already done it. Without all that stress in my life, my mind started to compulsively focus on the finer details. I ended up spending hours at a time poring through news articles that detailed missing persons or dead bodies that had been found from all over the Northwest. I didn't know what my dad had actually been doing to that guy, and sometimes I wish that I'd looked at the rest of the photos so I knew for sure. But I knew the guy's face, and I knew I'd be able to recognize him if his pictures were included in some missing persons or murder news piece. On multiple occasions, I considered how utterly futile it was spending hours at a time reading through random articles that listed the victim as having an Asian-sounding last name. It must have been hundreds from the past decade or so, and I didn't actually know when the incident in the photo had taken place. I realized that I was trying to find a needle in a haystack. But then, one day on some rainy Thursday afternoon, I found my needle. I don't want to tell you the poor guy's name because I don't want any of you reaching out to his family. They've definitely already been through enough. But like I said, I found him. I recognized the guy's face from a webpage, and it was a smile I swear I'd recognize anywhere. It was burned into my brain after having stared at those secret photos. The article gave a few details regarding his last known whereabouts, but mentioned that the guy had talked about visiting a friend in the weeks before his disappearance. They went on to plead for any information, basically saying that the police had no idea what had happened to the poor guy. I'd known for years. I just didn't quite realize it. Incidentally, the answer to my fixation brought up a whole new question. What was I going to do with this information? The answer was simple: nothing. There was nothing I could do that wouldn't have a devastating effect on my mom and sister. My sister wasn't very old, definitely not the age to process the fact that her father was at the very minimum involved in the disappearance of another human being. There was nothing I could do right then. Nothing I was okay with. But now that I had my answer, I could at least plan to do something in the future. I didn't quite know when that might be, and I wasn't quite sure how I'd go about it, but I knew I was going to confront him about it at least before he died. Yet, as it turned out, it wasn't my dad's impending death that prompted me to put my plan into action. It was my mom's. 2 years after I graduated college, I was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, when I got a phone call from my little sister. Mom had cancer. It was terminal, and it was aggressive. She had a few months tops. That's what the doctor said anyway. I plan on spending as much time as possible with her during that time. When she finally passed and the truth of what my dad had done could no longer hurt her, I made my move and did something I should have done more than 10 years prior. I called my dad for the first time in what felt like forever, and I gave him an ultimatum. I told him that I knew what he'd done, that it was me who had found the pictures all those years ago. I told him the only thing that stopped me from saying anything was not wanting to destroy our family, and that I wanted Mom to live a life of blissful ignorance before I finally tore apart his legacy. I gave him 2 choices. He could turn himself into the police and do the right thing, or I'd tell them everything I'd seen and how I could link it to the missing persons case from the late 90s that I'd found. The next day, I got another call from my sister, marking the second time she'd been the bearer of bad news in less than 6 months. My dad had taken his own life. It came as a shock. I considered the possibility that he might take his own life before I put my plan into action, but decided that he just wasn't the type. I figured he'd go on the run, try to move up to Alaska and change his name or something, maybe even leave the country. I guess it showed how little I really knew him, even up until the day he died. The only thing was, the whole thing didn't die with my dad. There was still more work to be done. I went back home to check his office for the pictures, intent on handing them to the police, but they were gone. I turned the house upside down, even checked the trash for ashes or things of that nature, but I found nothing. He must have destroyed them or disposed of them somewhere. But that wasn't good enough. He must have known that sooner or later, the cops would get him for whatever he'd been a part of, so he just decided to end it all and rob his victim's family of the justice they deserved. I went to the cops anyway, told them everything, and eventually received a call back from 2 homicide detectives. They called a handful of times over the course of the next few weeks, a few questions here and there. Eventually, I realized how difficult a task they were faced with. After DNA swabs of his office yielded no matches for their victim, there was very little they could really prove. Even if I did manage to turn over the photographs, the only person they showed committing a crime was a man in a mask. All they could do was speculate. Yet, I know it was my dad under there. In my mind, there's no reason why he'd take his own life. He cultivated such a wholesome facade over the years, having successfully concealed a past blackened by death, that no one thought him capable of such things. He was far too proud to watch it all crumble in front of him. But even now, it's still not over. My dad has since been considered a suspect in the disappearances of multiple young men throughout the 90s and early 2000s. I've still yet to hear anything from the police or FBI regarding it, but it's still something that's being actively considered. All these years later, I'm faced with the possibility that my father was an actual serial killer and that my silence following the discovery of the photographs enabled him to continue killing. I could be responsible for an untold number of unsolved murders all over the Northwest. When I tell people that, it's not enough to hear platitudes anymore. So judge me. Pour your scorn upon me. I promise you I can take it. As far as I'm concerned, I deserve far worse. This all went down in the summer of my 8th grade year. I was on my way to finally becoming a high schooler, and it was legitimately one of the best summers of my life. I had 3 weeks of no school until I was officially in high school. I spent my time mostly playing video games, sleeping, or playing basketball with my friends. I was actually home alone for an entire week, and my parents thought I could hold down the fort. I was a relatively good kid, and they trusted me. So it wasn't really that big of a deal. Besides, I had a cell phone, so if anything were to go wrong, I would have a way of calling someone for help. My dad also gave me access to one of his credit cards for when I got hungry and didn't want to eat what we had at the house. I was really stoked about having the house to myself. I've had people tell me that it was pretty messed up for my family to leave me alone for that amount of time, especially considering I was only 14. They didn't expect anything bad to happen, and neither did I. It was a rare occasion that they were gone for so long. This wasn't something they did often. As a matter of fact, I still live with my parents now, and I've just turned 19. Ever since that day when everything went down, I haven't been home on my own for more than 24 hours at a time. It was a Friday night around 11 p.m. when I heard my phone go off. I received a text message from an unknown number, and all it said was, "Hey." I messaged them back and asked who they were, and they immediately became passive-aggressive, upset with me for not knowing who it was. I apologized to them, thinking it was someone I was close with. I had just gotten a new phone a few months prior and lost all my contacts, so I explained that to them, and they still seemed pretty upset. They started harassing me, and I ended up thinking they were just pranking me, so I turned my phone on silent and continued playing my PlayStation. I'm not sure how long later, probably around 10 minutes or so, I heard a knock on my bedroom window. I thought I was just hearing things at first, but I still decided to check and see who was out there just in case. I moved my blinds to the side and looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. I wasn't convinced. I knew I heard a knock and was starting to become very paranoid. I looked through some of the windows throughout my house to see if I could spot anyone, but again, there was nobody. I can't deny the eeriness I felt. It was like something was about to happen, something really, really bad. I took my phone out to call my mom, and I had a bunch of notifications from that person who had texted me earlier. The most recent message said, "I'm outside." I couldn't believe what I was reading, and it made my nightmares and everything I was feeling come to life. I went to call my mom, and very quickly, I realized my phone wasn't picking up any service, which was extremely unusual. We have really good cell phone reception, especially at home. We never run into issues with that. At this point, I was literally terrified and had no clue what was happening. I had no way of contacting anyone, and I knew I was absolutely screwed. I wanted to message that person back and tell them to leave me alone, but obviously I couldn't because I had no service. If you're wondering why I didn't use my Wi-Fi to send an iMessage, it's because the person texted me wasn't on an iOS device. I was pacing around my living room when all of a sudden, I heard some noises coming from outside. I went in the direction of the noise, which was toward the back patio, and I listened. Someone was screaming for help at the top of their lungs. My heart began thumping out of my chest, and my initial reaction was that it was a setup. However, being brave in the moment and considering I took boxing classes for years and knew how to fight, I wanted to stick up for myself and whoever was potentially being hurt. I'm not going to lie, I was really wanting to beat the crap out of whoever was harassing me. Plus, I knew if I didn't do something now, something bad was likely to happen anyway. So I did the unthinkable. I walked outside to my back patio, and it was silent. The only thing I could hear was the crickets chirping. I waited for a second until I yelled out to whoever was there. I told them I was going to mess them up and acted a lot tougher than I felt. Almost right after that, there was an extremely bright light flashing at me from afar. Our house sits on quite a bit of land, and we have a huge backyard with tons of trees. Whoever it was pointed the light at me, clearly trying to piss me off. The light then began moving all around toward the house for a minute, then it turned off. Within an instant, the screaming picked back up again. It was the same voice pleading for help. I knew it was now or never. I ran back inside, into the garage, grabbed my old baseball bat as a weapon, and made my way back outside toward the woods, heading directly where I first saw the flashlight. My heart was fluttering at this point as I wasn't sure what to expect. As I got closer and closer, my anxiety about doubled. I couldn't believe that I was in this situation, and I had a sudden realization that what I was doing was pretty stupid. Right while I was about to turn around to go back inside, somebody from the woods that I couldn't see said something to me. It was so dark that I couldn't see anything. All I could see were the dark silhouettes of all the trees around me. I shouted loudly into the darkness, asking who was there. That was when the voice ahead of me whispered and told me to quiet down. He asked me to help him and said he was tied up to a tree and that someone had kidnapped him. Obviously, this alarmed me to the extreme. Despite me thinking it was possibly a setup, I went with my instincts and wanted to help him. It's going to be okay. Just calm down. I'm going to call the police for you. Just hang tight. That's when he started yelling at me. No, help me now. You don't understand. He's going to come back in a few minutes and kill me, he said. I was in a really bad situation as I just wanted to do the right thing. Okay, I'm coming. I'm right ahead. Just keep walking straight. I can already see you. My heart was beating at an incomprehensible rate now, so much so that I'm surprised I didn't pass out. All the thoughts crossing my mind set me into a panic, and I was fully into the woods at this point. I looked ahead after walking for maybe 20 or 30 seconds and saw a dark shadow that looked like a person about 30 feet away. Hey man, is that you? I asked, but he didn't reply. I sat in silence for a moment while I tried to piece together what the hell was happening. If that was him, or even if it wasn't, I was in some deep trouble because the man I was looking at definitely wasn't tied up to a tree. He was standing up straight and very much alive. In only a moment's time, the person started running at me. It was at that exact moment I started backing up. Slowly, I eventually snapped out of it and booked it all the way to my house. Somehow, I made it inside before he caught up to me. I shut and locked the sliding glass door behind me, and he was standing right there, pulling on the door, trying to get it open. He was a very tall but slender-looking man with a wolf mask and a big-ass hammer. I barely hesitated and ran to my room. I know what you're thinking right now too. Why didn't I just defend myself with the bat? Well, originally, that was my plan, but things happen. I don't know. I was absolutely terrified, and you would be too if you were in that same situation. I was pacing back and forth in my living room, trying my luck with my phone again, but still, I had no service. I started having some sort of manic episode and began screaming and punching my couch. I was extremely angry and sick of being the victim. I almost ran out there and beat him myself, but I chose a different approach. I waited patiently, and sure enough, after only a minute, he was knocking on my front door. I ran over to the door and told him to see what happens if he stepped even a single foot in my house. He wouldn't be walking out if he did, that's for sure. He then started laughing. I just kept quiet and went back to my room. The knocking grew louder and louder, and eventually, he started screaming. I had no idea what he was saying, but I think he was mocking me. A few minutes went by of this, and that's when I heard my living room window shatter. I got myself ready and hid behind my open bedroom door, just waiting for him to walk in. The footsteps got closer and closer as he walked into a few different rooms. Now he was heading to mine. I gripped the bat tighter and said a little prayer. He walked in, and I was able to hit him in the head with the bat. He fell straight to the ground. I hit him a few times while he was down as well, to make sure he wasn't getting back up anytime soon, and I ran. I ran down the road about 5 or 6 miles to my friend's house, and when I finally got them to answer the door, I briefly explained what happened, and they let me use their phone to call the police. A few police officers were sent to my house, and a few officers to my friend's house as well. I then called my parents, and they rushed home. They were over 2 hours away, so it was going to be a while before they made it back. I told the police exactly what happened, and it turned out I had killed the intruder. I didn't know if he was dead until the police officer told me. I was worried I was going to be in trouble, even though I didn't do anything illegal. It was self-defense. The police took me in for questioning, and since I was a minor at the time, they had to bring my parents in as well. Yes, I killed a man as a teenager, and everything about it has completely changed my life. I've been numb, I've been scared, and I've been anxious. I can't tell you how many nightmares I've had about this whole thing. It's all over, and this was years ago. Sometimes it feels like it only happened yesterday, and I relive the whole thing, the blood, the screaming, and more importantly, my lost innocence. I had blocked this story from my memory until my girlfriend reminded me of it a couple days ago. I started dating my girlfriend at the end of my senior year, and I used multiple dating apps before we started dating. I had my Snapchat listed in many of my dating app profiles. This is important. Nothing led to anything with the apps. I talked to people for a bit and eventually the conversation would die out. When I began dating my girlfriend, I had deleted the apps but never deleted my account, meaning people could still see my profile and my Snapchat account. I realized this after a few people would add me, but it didn't bother me much because I'd tell them I had a girlfriend. As you would imagine, the conversation would end at that point. But there was this one guy that added me, let's call him Adam. And he asked me if I was available. Being straight, I was used to guys adding me, so I gave him the usual response. Sorry, I'm straight and I have a girlfriend. I expected him to leave me alone, but it didn't stop him. At first the messages were normal. How was your day? What did you do today? Simple stuff like that. Being the nice guy I am, I responded because I thought this guy just wanted to be friends, and having a gay friend is okay with me. Then the messages progressively got more creepy. He started asking questions about my girlfriend, and not the basic questions. As the days passed, I started to notice that Tyler's vocabulary was very similar to Adam's. I wasn't sure about it, so I didn't make any assumptions that it was him. I shared Tyler's Snapchat with my girlfriend, who added him to investigate. As soon as she added Tyler's snap, Tyler flipped out on her, confirming that it was indeed Adam. Realizing this, I blocked him again. After that, everything went quiet from Adam for about a month. I live in the suburbs of Chicago, and both my girlfriend and I live down the street from each other. We often see each other, and our families are good friends. Anyway, A month went by until I received a letter with no address or name on it, just my name on the front. I opened it, and to my shock and horror, it was basically a love letter from Adam. The letter expressed his love for me and his desire for me to run off with him. The letter took a very sexual turn halfway through, with explicit descriptions of what he wanted to do to me. At that moment, I had two horrifying realizations. One was that he knew my address, and two, he had dropped off the letter himself, meaning he was in my town. I immediately called my girlfriend, who was equally shocked. After consulting with my parents, we called the cops. Unfortunately, since I had blocked and removed Adam's social media information and the letter had no return address, there was nothing we could do about it. Day after day, letters kept appearing in my mailbox until they also started showing up at my girlfriend's place. Her letters were far worse than mine. Adam wrote about how much he hated her and how he wanted to hurt her. He described in detail the ways he would inflict pain on her until she broke up with me. Like me, she reported this to the police, but they could do nothing about it. My girlfriend's family had plans to go to Hawaii for vacation, and I was house sitting for them. The first couple of days went fine until one of the last nights of the week. As usual, I was at their house, watching TV on the couch, when the power went out. It was around 1 a.m., and it was pitch black. The next few seconds were silent, and then I heard a window smash from the office. To help you understand the layout of the house, when you entered the front door, the living room was on your left, straight ahead were both the kitchen and stairs, and to the right were the office and dining room. Upstairs, as soon as you reached the top of the stairs, there was a bathroom straight ahead. My girlfriend's room was on the right, and the other bedrooms were on the left. I immediately grabbed a kitchen knife and ran upstairs to hide while I called the cops. I quickly got into my girlfriend's room and slipped into the closet. As soon as I was able to contact the operator, I heard the intruder pounding up the steps. Thankfully, I had relayed all the information to the operator in time, and she stayed on the phone as we both remained quiet. The intruder took a left when he reached the top of the stairs, which gave more time for the cops to arrive and for me to get ready, just in case I needed to defend myself. A few minutes passed until I heard the intruder start walking toward my girlfriend's room. In the precious seconds I had, I slipped out of the closet and positioned myself next to the door. As soon as he opened the door and started to enter the room, I took the kitchen knife and drove it into his shoulder. A young man screamed in pain as I heard a heavy metallic object make a large thud as it hit the ground. From there, I bolted out of the house, where I was met by 4 squad cars and cops with their guns raised. I raised my hands, shouting that he was upstairs in the right room. A few minutes passed, and the intruder was dragged out, still screaming in pain. With the siren lights flooding the street, I got a glimpse of his face. It was Adam. Later, an officer informed me that the metallic thud was caused by him dropping his handgun. Adam was from Texas and had traveled up to my state to be with me. He had rented a room at a local motel and would put letters in both my girlfriend's and my mailbox daily. He was doing this in the early hours of the morning. This was confirmed by the security footage from the motel he was staying at. On the night of the break-in, Adam had plans to kill my girlfriend and her family so that I would choose to be with him. He managed to pry open the power box, switched off the power to her house along with neighboring houses, and broke in with the intention of her being there. Well, unfortunately for him, she was enjoying a tropical vacation. To be honest, I have no idea how the outcome would have been different if they hadn't gone on vacation, and I am grateful that I still have my girlfriend as well as her family alive. So, to any stalkers out there, please stay away from my girlfriend. This happened to me over a decade ago, but I will never forget the feeling deep in my chest. Both that night and the next morning when the true nature of the situation became apparent. It was late December in a small Texas town. We just received 5 inches of snow earlier in the morning. I can't remember what time it was. All I remember is it was dark outside, and I was playing in my room. It's important to note that my room was made up of 2 parts, a mudroom with a door leading out front, then my actual bedroom. The door was an older style wood door with all the old hardware and had a window on the top half. It had a window shade, but that wouldn't stop anyone from looking in if they wanted. My room was the frontmost, with my parents' room being in the back of the house. Suddenly, the knob was not being gently moved. Someone was turning it with force. This door was one that had to be locked from the inside, so the knob could turn and open freely. Luckily, there were 2 deadbolts. Whoever was on the other side just figured out the knob was free to open. As soon as I heard it turn all the way, I sprung up to the wall about 5 feet from the door, my back to the wall. The door fell silent. I found myself glued to the wall, unable to move. Then, the knob turned slowly. I remember watching, waiting for it to turn all the way. When it did, whoever was on the other side started trying to budge the door and pry. At first, it was easy going, but then they started pounding into the door with their foot. They got only 2 kicks in when I unfroze and screamed for my life. I sprinted to the back of the house to get my parents. They asked what was wrong, and I said someone tried to break in. They ran over and checked, not bothering to look outside, which I pleaded them to. They just said my imagination was running wild and it was an animal or the old age of the house. They took one final look in my mudroom, not bothering to investigate any further. I was told to go to bed. It took me hours. I don't even remember falling asleep. All I remember is staring at the door from my bed, never taking my eyes off the doorknob. Suddenly, I was woken up by my parents, who were obviously distressed and seemed to be scared. My mom grabbed me by both shoulders and got right in front of me. She asked very sternly why I thought someone tried to break in. When I told them this time, they seemed to listen. I was worried how serious they were as they asked me about everything. When I was done, they said they had to show me something. They took me to the front door and out to the front yard, pointing to my door near the driveway. You could clearly see the bootprints in the snow, walking along the street through our yard and straight to my window, then my mudroom door, where I had been playing the night before. The police showed up and took a report, but nothing ever came of it. I was never able to sleep well in that house. I can never forget what it felt like as a child to go through this and not have my parents believe me. I'm just glad I was not home alone and very thankful for that strong door. Hello. I'm a 20-year-old French girl. To set the context, I live in a suburb in a small residence with 6 houses. My gate is often broken, and most of the time it's wide open, giving easy access to our small courtyard. My house has 1 floor with 4 bedrooms, including mine. Downstairs, there's a guest bedroom which we use as a treatment room due to my health issues. It's where we keep all the equipment and medicines. I also have a dog who means the world to me. He feels everything and even senses my epileptic seizures before they happen. He can even tell when the nurses are arriving by the sound of their tires in our yard. He never barks unless there's a problem. A nurse visits me 4 to 5 times a day for treatments, including infusions. This is an important part of my story. One morning, as usual, My nurse, Sandra, arrived at 8 a.m. She administered my treatment, and we chatted like we always did. After about 40 minutes, she left, saying she might be a little late next time, but I shouldn't be worried. That day, my parents were at work, and I had a medical appointment in the morning. I was home alone, except for the nurse's visits every 4 hours. When I returned from my appointment, I sat on the sofa with my dog while waiting for the next nurse. When I heard tire noises, I thought it was Sandra arriving a bit early. My dog started growling, which was unusual. I looked at the time, 11:50 a.m. I assumed Sandra might have switched with the previous patient, as she sometimes did. I heard a knock and I went to the door. I saw a young woman I had never met before. She introduced herself as Camille, a third year at nursing school, and explained that Sandra had sent her to prepare my treatment. I wasn't suspicious. I was used to students coming over. But I was a bit surprised because Sandra usually informed me in the morning or sent a message. Also, she never left a student alone on the first visit. I led Camille to the treatment room and showed her the way. While she washed her hands, my dog's behavior became strange. He growled as she approached me and circled me, so I decided to leave him in the living room and close the door to keep him calm. I didn't pay much attention to what Camille was doing. I was on my phone at that moment. Then, I noticed she was preparing a syringe rather than using the pre-made saline syringe as usual. I glanced up and saw that my treatment ampoules were untouched, but I had heard the distinct sound of ampoules breaking. Something felt off. As she approached me with the syringe, I received a message from Sandra saying she'd be there in 5 minutes and asked me to start setting up the equipment. I made up an excuse, telling Camille that I needed to use the restroom and left her in the treatment room. My dog kept barking and growling. When I reached the toilet downstairs, I sent Sandra a message telling her about the woman, and she had no idea what I was talking about. I was terrified and started crying in the bathroom. Camille came to check on me and asked if everything was okay. I assured her it was, and that's when I heard the front door slam shut. 2 minutes later, it reopened, and I heard Sandra's voice. I left the bathroom, still crying, and Sandra asked me what had happened. I explained the situation and showed her the treatment room. We called the police, who arrived, examined the evidence, and took samples from the syringe and other items prepared by Camille. The test results were shocking. The syringe contained a paralyzing substance, enough to paralyze a 120 kilograms man, and the IV contained a highly concentrated medicine that could have stopped anyone's heart. To this day, we don't know who Camille really was. Thankfully, I never heard from her again. She had stolen all my opioids but left my tablet and computer untouched. Looking back, I realized my dog had sensed Camille's ill intentions. I should have been more vigilant, especially since she was a stranger and on her own. My treatments are far from simple. I often wonder what could have happened if I hadn't checked my phone that day. Okay, before I get into the story, there's a few things I need to explain about my country, South Africa, for you to fully understand the story. In South Africa, it's normal to have high brick walls with electric gates, electric fences, and alarms. The crime here is hectic. It's also pretty normal to have big gardens. My family and I are big animal lovers, so at the time we had 6 dogs. 2 Shar-Peis, 2 German short-hair pointers, and 2 dachshunds. With that being said, our dogs roam freely around the garden as it's obviously enclosed. We usually leave the veranda door open during the day for them to do their thing. Another thing about South Africa, it's normal to have a live-in maid and a gardener. Like, the average family usually employs them. It's not only for wealthy people, which seems to be a thing in other countries. For the story, our maid is Ellie and our gardener is Vince. So this happened in 2007 while I was 9 years old. My older brother was 10 and we had just gotten our first cell phones that day. My dad surprised us after work. You may think we were quite young to have phones, but it was used for emergencies or to communicate with our parents. Anyways, it's an important piece of info for the story. We don't usually leave our veranda door open at night due to security reasons, but I remember it being a hot summer night that night. So of course, this night of all nights, the veranda door was wide open and the dogs were doing their thing in the garden. My brother and I were in my parents' room setting up our new cell phones, all excited. Ellie's daughter, who was 18, was like an older sister to us, and she was helping my brother and I. My dad was somewhere in the house and my mom was in the bath. I specifically remember the maid's daughter making a comment about how the dogs would not shut up and how annoying it was. That's why I noticed it as well. Sure, they bark, but it was usually the dachshunds that yapped when the bigger dogs just chilled. Plus, it would only happen for a few minutes, then they'd get over it. Something was different that night, as even the bigger dogs were barking non-stop. My dad appeared in our room and mentioned to us that he also noticed the dog's incessant barking and he was going to check if everything was okay. No alarm bells went off in my head, and I don't believe my dad thought anything was amiss either, because my brother asked to investigate with him and my dad agreed. I was obviously too engrossed in my new Sony Ericsson. My dad said he had a terrible feeling because of this, and because of how out of character the dogs were acting. He called after them. They usually come running, but tonight they all seemed to just look at him. They then turned back around and continued going crazy at this dark corner down the steps. My dad told my brother to go back inside the house and get a torch, sort of using it as an excuse for my brother not to come with him because of this off feeling. When my brother went back inside, my dad slowly approached the steps. He noticed how the dogs seemed to be snapping at whatever it was, hiding just out of view in the darkness. As he got to the steps, he noticed the lamp was smashed. Confused, he inched to the steps, and just as he realized what was happening, it was too late. My dad, being an ex-vet and avid hunter, felt something cold against his temple and immediately knew it was a gun. 4 men in balaclavas stepped out of the darkness, all armed. Shocked, he stood frozen on the steps. The man holding the gun to his head was instantly aggressive and asked him where my brother was. He said that he saw my dad come out with my brother, but my brother went back into the house. My dad said something came over him, and before he knew what he was saying, he responded by saying he's gone inside to press the panic button. As he said it, he saw how all of these guys started to panic. They started speaking in an African language called Zulu, assuming my dad couldn't understand because it's not common for white people to speak it. But my dad had actually grown up on a farm where he learned it fluently because of the farm workers. The aggressive guy holding the gun said, in Zulu, "Shit. The cops will be here any minute. Let's just kill this guy, grab what we can, and leave." The others seemed apprehensive, and a smaller guy seemed really on edge and continued to say how he can't go back to jail again. And they need to get out of there before the cops show, which would be any minute. He was panicking. My dad then took advantage of this guy's fear. My dad interrupted them, speaking English, pretending to not understand what they're saying, and said that we usually have armed response vehicles that drove in our area, and since my brother pushed the panic button so long ago, they'll probably be here any second. and that did the trick. My dad watched as their plan unraveled before them. The smaller, scared guys started freaking out all the other guys, saying that they need to leave ASAP, or else they'd be caught. He seemed to make the others more nervous and lose confidence until they started full-on bickering amongst themselves. Their plan was slowly turning to shit, as a third guy had put it. The aggressive guy pointing the gun to my dad's head slowly lowered it as they started fighting, losing focus on my dad and shifting his focus onto his crew. My dad then used this as an opportunity to slowly back up the steps and turn to dart towards the house. As luck would have it, as my dad ran into the veranda door, my oblivious brother was heading out with a torch. My dad scooped him up under his arm and sprinted into the house, not even closing the door behind him. Silly, but I think he just wanted to get my brother inside as quick as possible without even thinking. The maid's daughter and I were obviously also oblivious to everything when my dad rushed through the bedroom door, slammed it shut, and told us to go upstairs into the attic. There's 5 guys outside with guns. They're here to hurt us. Get upstairs now. My heart sank. I remember my body automatically responding and me sprinting to the stairs. My mom ran out of the bathroom in a towel, not too far behind. We sat there in the darkness and silence. I swear you could hear a pin drop. I think we were all just waiting to hear something below us in the rooms. My mom cursed, saying she didn't have a phone, and neither did my dad. But as luck would have it, in my hand was my brand new Sony Ericsson. No better emergency to use it than now, right? My mom dials the police, and I kid you not, when they asked where we lived, they told us it wasn't in their jurisdiction. Sorry. Click. The line goes dead. We're now not only shitting ourselves, but we're flabbergasted. My mom starts cursing like a sailor again, and that's when my dad realizes, damn. He didn't close the veranda door, and what about Ellie and Vince, who are in their rooms, blissfully unaware of the danger they're in? He gets his firearm in the safe in the attic and tells us that whatever we hear, to not come downstairs. To stay hidden no matter what. Now I'm sobbing, begging my dad not to leave us, but he tells us he has to go get the others before something bad happens to them. Now there's even more tears, as reality hits that there's 2 other people still in danger. The maid's daughter is understandably in hysterics, because she's also fearing for her mom downstairs. My dad disappears and the air is thick with tension. We can still hear the dogs going crazy, indicating that those men were still on our property. My mom then calls another number, the armed security that drives around the area, and they say they'll be over in about 10 to 15 minutes. They say to wait and stay hidden until they ring our bell at the gate. We all wait in silence, fearing that we'll hear a gunshot or anything indicating these men are in our house. But there was just silence. The only sound was the dog's barks outside. After what seemed like hours, most likely a couple minutes, we heard stomping coming up the stairs and my heart rate quickened. I remember shutting my eyes and praying that it was my dad, with Ellie and Vince. Luckily, it was. We all hid for a while, no one dared to speak. The dogs seemed to have calmed down considerably, but were still barking every now and then. The gate intercom rang and my dad told us to wait while he checked if it was the security company, and sure enough, it was. He opened up and the nightmare was over. I remember standing up and my knees buckling from the adrenaline my body endured. The armed security somehow notified the right police for our jurisdiction, and everyone investigated the garden. They found that there were actually 7 pairs of footprints and that these guys had bent the spikes on our wall and just climbed over. We got an electric fence shortly after. So there must have been 2 other guys hiding in the shadows that my dad hadn't seen. which is actually creepy in its own right. South Africa's violent crime is quite bad, and it's sickeningly common for torture and other terrible things to happen during home invasions. I was obviously so young at the time, I didn't know the horrors of the world and was just scared of my family getting hurt. Now that I'm older, just the thought of 4 women being in the house and my mom being in nothing but a bath towel gives me the chills to this day. The cops said the fact that there were so many guys, instead of like 1 to 3, indicates that these guys possibly had sinister intentions. Thank goodness nothing happened to my family, and I'm forever thankful for my dad's quick thinking regarding the panic button. Also, I'm so glad my dad understands Zulu and could manipulate the situation to benefit us. Lastly, my family will forever be in debt to our good boys and girls that warned us that night. A terrifying and life-changing outcome would have 100% happened had it not been for our incredible dogs. From that day onwards, my dad always gave them leftover rice or meat with their dinner. I'm sure there was a special place in heaven reserved for you angels. This all happened roughly around 4 years ago, but the experience has haunted me almost every single day since it happened. I'll start off by saying that at the time I was pretty young. I was single and very keen to have my first experience with someone. I spent a while looking through dating apps, talking to a few people, until I finally came across a guy who seemed interesting. We had a lot of things in common, so I thought it would be a good idea to meet up with him since we had been talking for almost a month. Now, even though I was only young, I wasn't naive or stupid. I was, and still am, a very cautious and paranoid person. But for some reason, I made what possibly could have been one of the worst decisions of my life. I invited him to come spend the night at my place. My parents were away for the weekend and I had the place to myself, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity for him to come over. He lived around 3 hours away from my place, yet he was eager and almost desperate to visit. So he set off as soon as he finished work, which was around 11 a.m. The whole time he was driving to my place, I had the sickening sense of impending doom. Almost as if something was going to go very, very wrong. I almost texted him multiple times to tell him that I wasn't interested anymore, but I hesitated as he was only 10 minutes away by this point. I jumped up as I heard his car pull up, and I expected to be greeted by a smile once I opened the door. But he pushed his way through, and continued to stare at me blankly, all whilst my 2 French bulldogs snarled and growled at him, which they never do to anyone. Things instantly seemed extremely odd. He followed me quickly to my bedroom and didn't waste any time in aggressively undressing me. I hesitantly went along with it, as this was my first experience with someone. He was almost 6 years older than me, so I was pretty tense. Fast forward to a couple of hours later, he suddenly asked me if he could sleep in my room, which confused me as it was only 5 p.m. But I told him it was fine, and I would continue to watch movies by myself downstairs. After about an hour, I heard what sounded like furniture being moved around and the sound of him talking. So I made my way upstairs and opened my door, only to find him crouching in the middle of my room and breathing extremely heavily. When I asked if he was okay, he motioned for me to get on the bed. He sat me on his lap and proceeded to place a blindfold over my eyes, putting his hands around my neck lightly. I was already feeling extremely uncomfortable, and it worsened as he tightened his grip around my throat. He asked, "Does anyone know I'm here? Do your friends know who I am and what I look like?" I instantly answered, saying that my sister and friends knew he was here. This was a complete lie because I don't have a sister, and my friends were unaware, but something inside of me forced me to say it. After minutes of awkward silence, he stood up to gather his things. I noticed that in his backpack, he had tape, rope, and handcuffs. At first, it didn't concern me as I knew he was into that stuff, but looking back, I think it was intended for something much worse. All of a sudden he said, "I think I'm going to head home. I have a long drive, and I'm rather tired." I didn't hesitate to let him out of my door because I was already extremely uncomfortable. As he left, he failed to even look at me or say goodbye. He raced off down the street as soon as he got into his car. I ran back to my room to see if he had left anything, because he'd left in a hurry. I found a note on my desk with the words, "Being nice is what saved you." At the time, I had no idea what the note meant. Now that I think about it, I seriously think that he had very ill intentions toward me. I'm still angry at myself for letting a stranger into my home, which was obviously a big mistake. I immediately blocked him on all of my social media. I am just so lucky that I made it out alive. All I know is that he is now somewhere back in America. I don't really know why he was living in the UK at the time that I met him, but all I can say now is that I am glad that he is many miles away from me. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after I finished school. We shared rent on an apartment together since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making better money, and he planned to move out once the lease came to an end. I wasn't making a lot, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the apartment alone. I looked around online for a roommate for a few months, but decided to move out as well and find a cheaper place. I searched until the last month of our lease at the apartment. My brother had basically moved everything out already, and there was a lot of pressure on me to find somewhere quick. But with my extremely low budget, it was hard. Eventually, I stumbled across a listing posted by a homeowner renting out a room in their house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a text to let him know I was interested, then kept searching. He responded within a few minutes. We scheduled a time to call later in the day, and when we did, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I'd be able to use all the other rooms in the house. It sounded great to me, so I agreed to it. A couple of weeks later, I packed everything in a U-Haul and drove down to the house. Between this time, we'd been texting and calling, and he sent me a bunch of pictures, but I hadn't had the chance to view it in person yet. I got there around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage, waving me over. He gave me a quick tour, then helped me unload all of my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a regular man in his mid-30s, which was almost 10 years older than myself, but I didn't really mind. He didn't hold conversations very well, and was somewhat shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside, and I dropped the U-Haul off. I Ubered back to the house, and by then, it was almost 8 p.m., and I was really tired. Evan was on the couch, watching TV, so I told him I was going to bed early, and I went to my room. All in all, it seemed like a decent place, and I was happy with it. I unpacked some more, then set up my bed, and by 9 o'clock, I was finally ready to sleep. I walked over to my door to lock it and turn off the lights. But as I reached my hand out, I saw the knob on the door was empty. As in, there was no lock on it. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I stepped into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed that, but he would switch it around tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay, then went back to my room. I was tired and not too worried about it, but it was definitely an odd find. I got in bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone moving around in the kitchen, which I assumed was just Evan getting water or something. I closed my eyes again. A minute later, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he was passing my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He was standing out there quietly for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He locked my door. My stomach dropped, and I felt my face go cold as Evan walked down to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I got up quietly and went over to the door. I tried the handle, and it wouldn't budge. I stood in shock for a few seconds, coming to the reality that this man I just met has now locked me in a room. My fear started to turn into anger, and I called out for Evan, telling him to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan run out of his room and over to my door. I heard him place his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before he unlocked it. I swung the door open right away. What the hell was that? I confronted him. Evan was stumbling over his words, saying he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me well enough. I understood that concern, but locking someone in a room was not a smart way to go about it. I told him that I was going to pack up and leave in the morning. I stayed up all night on the couch in the living room, waiting for the U-Haul store to open at 9 o'clock. I looked into the hallway, seeing Evan's bedroom door was still closed, hopefully meaning he was still asleep. Then I drove straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I went inside, Evan's bedroom door was open. Evan? I called out. I walked over to his room and peeked my head inside. His room was empty. I moved my eyes around the room in disbelief, seeing as things were only getting weirder. I backed out and got straight to moving my stuff. I powered through 2 hours of moving boxes and taking apart my bed. I only had 2 boxes left, and I ran inside and picked up another, then rushed to the front door until Evan appeared in the doorway. "Move," I said. He stared at me emotionless. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. I hurried past him and shoved the box in the U-Haul. The last box was half full of random food I kept from my old pantry at the apartment. I decided to just leave it. Evan was freaking me out, and I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. I started closing the back of the U-Haul before Evan interrupted. "You forgot this." He held out the last box. "Oh yeah, thanks." I grabbed it from him and climbed back into the truck. I felt him watching me as I stacked the box, and when I turned, he had his hand on the door. He started pulling it down, trying to close me in. I was able to stop him before the door was even halfway down. I shoved him to the ground, but he got up and ran. Not into the house, but off into the trees, away from the property. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't care. I quickly shut the back door and drove away. My brother was nice enough to let me stay with him until I found a new place. I don't know what happened at that house, or what would have happened, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. My roommate was out of the house for the week, so I had the place to myself. It was spring break, so my college classes were out. I had no plans and really nothing I needed to do. On Monday, I was basically trapped inside due to a huge storm blowing through our city. This was common around this time of year, but it still always seemed worse every time. The trees always looked like they were going to blow away, and the house would shake and creak non-stop. Knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep, I decided to just stay up. I turned on the Xbox and started up one of my video games and played for well over an hour, probably until 11 o'clock when the doorbell rang. I paused the game and got up, but then I remembered the whole storm situation. Who would be outside right now? I went over to the front door and looked through the peephole, but nothing. I opened the door. The wind and water hit me right away, but when I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I closed the door and thought maybe the wind had somehow rung the doorbell. I don't know, it sounds dumb now, but what was I supposed to think? I went back to my game, but only a couple minutes later, I heard a huge crash in the backyard, stuff tumbling over and breaking. I immediately knew it was our patio furniture and ran over to the back door. Everything was scattered around the yard, blowing around in the wind. I quickly put on my shoes and went outside, pushing each piece of furniture up against the back of the house. The wind was so heavy it would even hurt sometimes when the water would hit my face. I was rushing, going as fast as I could until I saw someone. They were standing at the edge of the backyard, watching me. I looked back at them for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and ran inside to escape the rain. I looked at the back door as I dried off, but the person was gone. Between that and the doorbell ringing, I was a little bit nervous. I sat in the living room this time, just scrolling on my phone because I was tired of being interrupted. After a while, I struggled to keep my eyes open. I got a blanket and laid down on the couch. I didn't feel like going upstairs, and the storm was much louder up there. It took a while, but eventually, I drifted off and fell asleep. A few hours later, still well into the night, I woke up from a sudden burst of heavy wind outside, shaking the house. I pulled the blanket to the side and sat up, moving my feet to the floor as I prepared to go check if the furniture outside was still there. But just when my feet touched the floor, they were soaked. It woke me up immediately. I looked down and saw a puddle on the ground right next to the couch. Then I saw another, leading in a line across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint muddy shoe prints. I stood up and ran to the corner of the room, heart beating rapidly in my chest. After a minute of hearing nothing but the wind outside, I slowly followed the shoe prints. They led all throughout the house, upstairs and down, but I could clearly tell that they entered through the back door, which I had stupidly forgotten to lock in the rush of getting out of the rain. I locked it and pulled my phone out to call 911, but then the thought crept into my mind, what if they're still inside? I stayed quiet and moved into the corner of the house where I felt the most hidden. I waited in silence for them to arrive. When they did, they took a look around, seeing everything I saw, but nothing more. They told me it seems like a personal attack because nothing was missing, and they were clearly focused on my house in particular. However, they walked right up to me while I was sleeping and seemingly did nothing but watch me, which is super creepy but doesn't make much sense. If they wanted to do something to me, they would have done it at that moment. After some thought, this had led me to believe that whoever it was had actually come from my roommates. They saw me, then looked around the whole house, and then left, doing absolutely nothing. So if this was a personal attack and my roommate was there, I think things may have gone a lot worse than they had. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no street lights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I had never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footsteps as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be placed in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over. I assumed in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line along with some foil and an empty pen, which the police said people often use to smoke meth, so they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and get motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even practiced doing that at my new place, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. I was just 14 years old, and it seemed like an ordinary night. It was roughly around 9 p.m. I was at my younger cousin's house, and I was babysitting for the night. Both of our parents had gone out for drinks and weren't going to be back until late. We were just lounging around, sitting in the living room, watching random shows on television. So we're sitting there, and I was feeling really unsettled. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to ignore it and kept watching TV with my cousin, who was happily enjoying my company. The feeling wasn't going away. So I got up and walked to the back door to lock it. When I came back through the kitchen, I realized what was causing my weird feeling. In the window, there was a very decrepit and homeless-looking man, just staring into the window, looking at my young cousin. Protective mode turned on. I pretended like I didn't see the guy and I told my little cousin that we needed to go upstairs because our parents would be home soon and they wouldn't want him to be staying up late. I went upstairs and put him to bed, knowing damn well that there was a man outside that wanted to get in. At the time, I was about 125 pounds and 5'8", and I played football for my school. If I remember correctly, I went downstairs and straight into the kitchen and grabbed one of those meat tenderizing hammers. I turned back to the window where I saw him before. He wasn't there. So I ran back to the front door and checked that it was locked. Both the deadbolt and the knob were locked. I ran back upstairs with my meat tenderizer and went into my cousin's room and sat down in front of the door. He asked me what I was doing and I said that he didn't need to worry about it and that he should keep his head low. I called the cops and then my dad and uncle. Cops said they would take half an hour and my dad and uncle were 45 minutes away. All of a sudden I hear a window shatter and the sound of heavy boots walking around on the tiles. I told my cousin to stay calm and hide under the covers. I whispered to him that he needed to stay silent. I could hear the guy walking around downstairs. It was horrifying. I gripped that damn meat tenderizer and waited. About 5 minutes pass, and then I hear the boots walking upstairs. At this point, I was having a freaking heart attack. My cousin's door is no more than 10 feet from the stairs. I heard him opening the doors to my uncle's room, then the bathroom. My cousin's door was next along the hallway. I was shaking with adrenaline at this point. Suddenly, he decided to walk back downstairs, and I heard him open the door to the basement. 15 minutes later, the police showed up and burst into the house. They came up to our room, and I told them that I heard him go into the basement. They rushed down there and caught the guy without much fuss. It turned out the guy was loose from a mental hospital from the city about 20 miles away. He had the mental age of a child and had broken into a few other houses in the area. I had nightmares for months afterwards. About 10 years ago, I lived on my own and didn't have much company. I was quite depressed at the time after losing my girlfriend to a drunk driver. I was enjoying a beer and watching the sunset on the back porch when I saw a large, scruffy man emerging from the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as he stumbled towards my house in a menacing way. Living alone, I often used my backyard for target practice. And at that moment, I was immensely grateful for it. Instinctively, I rushed to bolt all the doors while frantically dialing the police. What I didn't know was that this intruder had broken in the day before through a basement window and had spent the night squatting there. He had left the basement door unlocked, and at this point, he'd made his way inside the house and was making his way up the stairs towards me. I gripped my rifle, aiming it at the approaching man as he descended the hallway. I shouted at him, ordering him to stop and get on the ground, but he just kept walking towards me. I fired the first round, loaded with rock salt, but he showed no reaction, undeterred. I quickly followed with a rubber bullet to the chest. Yet the drugged-up guy, who was clearly out of his mind, continued advancing. This guy was huge, at least twice my size, and I realized that whatever drugs he had in his body were going to push him through any pain that a rubber bullet would inflict. He was backing me into a corner. I desperately begged him to stop and warned him what would happen, but he just moaned at me like a zombie and lunged towards me. I took my third shot. I can't recall whether it was buckshot or a slug, but it left a gaping hole in his chest. It barely even slowed him down. He kept coming, and in a frenzied struggle, he wrestled me to the ground. He was moaning and coughing up blood. Suddenly, he grabbed my face with both of his massive hands and started squeezing my head. It was utterly terrifying. I could feel him trying to burst my skull open like a balloon. I don't know how long it actually lasted, but it felt like forever. Eventually, the injury finally caught up with him, and he died on top of me. I was laying with him crushing me for a few minutes. My energy was completely drained, and I could barely breathe with his weight on top of me. His body was pushing my rifle into my chest, and it was causing me serious pain when I tilted his body to the side. I was completely drenched in his blood, and I can still remember the overwhelming smell. I'd completely forgotten that I was still on the phone with the operator, who had heard our entire exchange, which more or less amounted to me pleading, "Stop, or I'll shoot," and the man menacingly taunting. The police arrived soon after, and the incident made it to the local papers. There was a criminal investigation, but eventually, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. It turned out that the intruder was wanted for murder of an elderly couple in Baltimore and had somehow made his way 50 miles up the road into our rural area. I was 18 and chilling in my friend's apartment alone. We lived in a duplex. He was on the top floor and I was on the bottom. Ironically, I was watching a horror movie when I hear something huge come through the front door and into the kitchen. I got up to see who was there. We threw huge parties all the time, so it wasn't really that odd for some random to just show up. But then I saw this dude. He was a huge country boy wearing overalls and holding a huge butcher's knife, just looking at me while standing in the kitchen. I might have said something, I don't remember. But I promptly rushed out of a side door, ran into my apartment and locked all the doors. I don't remember who I called or exactly what happened, but I know I waited until I couldn't hear anyone moving around upstairs anymore and crept back in. Big guy was passed out on the couch. Turns out he was on parole for domestic abuse charges, had gotten super sauce downtown, and made it to the apartment where he used to live. He was arrested and we never heard from him again, so I assume his parole didn't go too well. I also have another story from that apartment, possibly related. Again, I was home alone and waiting for my friend to get back so we could play some Xbox. It's like 1 a.m. and suddenly there's aggressive banging on the door. As I mentioned, it wasn't unusual to have unexpected guests, but banging like this? Not normal. I get closer to the door and this guy is screaming about money, and he kept referring to someone called Big Man. Open the door, Big Man. Big Man apparently owed him $10,000 and he was here to collect. He had something metal. I assumed it was a gun or a metal baseball bat. I could hear the clang noise when he'd smack the door. I was pretty high at the time and didn't know what to do, so I just stood on the other side of the door for about 20 minutes whilst he shouted abuse and tried to kick the door down. Pretty dumb, but I was young and stupid. He did eventually leave and I don't know if he came back one night during a party or what, but I never heard about him again. One final thing that happened in that apartment. It was the day after a party. My flatmate was once again out and it was just me at home. There was a knock at the door and I looked through and could see a delivery guy. I opened the door and he says he's got a delivery for me, already paid for. He's just carrying a delivery bag that seems suspiciously light. He asks where's Jason and I ask who that is. He tells me Jason ordered it and says he can only deliver to Jason because he paid for it. I didn't know anyone with that name and the guy didn't look like your typical delivery guy. I told him he must have the wrong address and this guy shoves his hand in the door and pushes it open whilst I'm trying to close it. We have this intense standoff where I'm trying to tell him that Jason doesn't live here and he insists that I let him in to check. He gives me this serious stare and tells me it's just Jason he needs to see. He decided to drop the delivery man act, and it was clear that he and Jason had business. I was about to let him in to prove that Jason didn't live here when my flatmate came home and celebrated the fact that I'd ordered pizza. The guy dropped his bag and left. It took me a while to put all of the strange encounters together. The guy on parole who'd broken in originally was probably the guy that owed people money and had people showing up to get him to pay. We both moved out a few weeks later. That place was too much trouble.